Admiral Amirius Revelt, a true demigod. Upon hearing Bilt's reveal, a few words immediately appeared in Klein's mind. I'm sorry. Bye. Gehrman Sparrow pricked up his brows slightly as Bilt hurried to explain, this wouldn't influence the difficulty of the mission. There's no need for anyone to display a demigod's powers throughout the duration of the mission. He cleared his throat and forced a smile. To make the mission not as difficult, His Excellency has specially arranged for him to inspect the Oravi naval base for a few days. This way, he doesn't need to stay in the Central Sonia Seas Navy headquarters, the city of Generosity, Bayam. As such, he will avoid Sea King Jan Kotman and the Governor-General of the Rorstad Archipelago, George Negan. He would avoid most of the subordinates he's familiar with, and he'll avoid his family who operates the family estate over there. He will also avoid his mistress who he's most familiar with. That is to say that you wouldn't need to face demigods, or the test of the masses. Here, there will only be 3 people who are familiar with His Excellency. The first is his secretary, Lieutenant Colonel Luan. He belongs to MI9, and he's in charge of monitoring His Excellency. He likely uses many names, and I'm not sure which is his real name. The second person will be the local mistress His Excellency has here, a beautiful lady by the name of Cynthia. It's said that her ancestor was a noble before his title was stripped, and his family was exiled here. The third person is Oravi's Governor-General, Aston Revelt, the youngest brother of His Excellency. Earl Revelt from the House of Lords is their elder brother. It really doesn't sound too difficult. Besides, my divination results tell me that it's not too dangerous. Klein fell silent for a few seconds before nodding gently. I need the detailed information regarding Amirius Revelt. We've already prepared everything. This is his photograph. These are the descriptions of any unique traits hidden on his body. These are the unique points of his accent. These are the common words he uses. These are the different reactions and attitudes he has towards different matters. Here is the detailed information regarding his interactions with Luan, Cynthia, and Aston. Bilt was delighted as he produced all the information he received from Admiral Amirius Revelt. Klein first took the photograph and saw a middle-aged gentleman with black hair and blue eyes. He had a strict and old-fashioned demeanor, and his hair was a lot more voluminous than most Loan men. He nodded indiscernibly before looking up. I know this is a lot of information, but I believe that you can memorize them all in 2 days. You have to be very professional in such matters. Before Bilt finished his sentence, he subconsciously took a step back because the person before him wasn't Gehrman Sparrow but Amirius Revelt. The strict and arrogant vibes he exuded was no different from the actual person. Holy Lord of Storms, this is almost a miracle. Bilt looked him up and down, and he couldn't help but be amazed. However, you can be another 3 centimeters taller. Your legs can be thicker. But it's fine, there's no rush. His Excellency will arrive the day after tomorrow with the Imperial Navy's 1st Central Sonia Fleet. He would inspect the Oravi Naval Base in the morning and attend a banquet held at the Governor-General's office. I have an invitation to it, and I can bring you there. You can watch from His Excellency's actions and the way he interacts with different people from the side. As he spoke, he received the £500 that Sothoth had taken out from the safe. He handed it to Klein and said, I hope for a pleasant partnership. Klein weighed the notes in his hand and studied it with a few glances before saying, I hope for a pleasant partnership. Ellipsis. Backland, William Street. As an inconspicuous member of the Red Gloves, Leonard Mitchell leaned on the outer wall of a house, awaiting the preliminary investigation work to end. He had his right leg raised slightly, with only his toes to the ground. It made him look desultory. After a while, he saw his teammate return with a somewhat complex expression. He was excited, puzzled, expectant, and nervous. Thompson, is there a conclusion? Leonard's heart stirred as he leaned over with a smile. Yeah, Thompson nodded and answered frankly. Both sides have spoken the truth. They have no way of lying in their dreams. Thompson, with his thin hair, wore his top hat once again. Their descriptions are uniform. Beneath this street is a ruin belonging to the 4th epoch's Tudor dynasty. The entrance is indeed that abandoned chapel. No one knows if there's another entrance for now. Is that so? Leonard didn't delve into the details as he exchanged a few words before moving to the sidelines. Once again, he leaned against the wall. He looked around and suppressed his voice. Old man, this is what you're good at. There's a Tudor family ruin hidden here. An elderly voice rang out in his mind. You're becoming more and more impolite. In our era, disrespect to high-ranking people implies being made into living sacrifices. Also, it's impossible for there to only be one Tudor family ruin in Backland. Are they lying? Leonard asked softly. The elderly voice chuckled and said, No, they just don't know enough. If my theories are correct, this ruin likely belongs to the Tudor Trunsost United Empire. What? Leonard was stunned. This was an ancient dynasty he had never heard of before. The slightly aged voice chuckled. What an unknowledgeable kid. After the Solomon Empire was first destroyed, it was replaced by the Tudor Trunsost United Empire. Its double consul ruled all of the northern continent. Double consul. Leonard ruminated over this phrase. The slightly aged voice chuckled and sighed. In the ruins underground, there should be 41 inverted candlesticks on the left and 40 on the right. 2 of them look like they belong to the throne of a giant, and it might be where Alista Tudor became Blood Emperor. Leonard frowned slightly before easing them. He said with a relaxed smile, there must be quite a lot of secrets hidden in there. Of course, but you aren't qualified to know it. The slightly aged voice tsked. Leonard curled his lips indiscernibly and said, What follows next is the exploration of the ruins. The slightly aged voice chuckled before falling silent. A minute later, Leonard saw Archbishop St. Anthony and the Church of Steam's Archbishop Horamek end their conversation as they returned to their own camps. Immediately following that, Horamek ordered all machinery hivemind personnel to leave, leaving the area to the Church of the Evernight Goddesses Nighthawks. What happened? Upon seeing this scene, Leonard was filled with puzzlement. At that moment, all the Nighthawks heard Archbishop St. Anthony's voice. All red gloves gather. The other Nighthawks are to leave the Mirror World. Find a reason to evacuate all the residents in the area, and promise them compensation for their property. After all the residents evacuate, the Red Gloves and I will destroy this ruin that stems from an evil era. Entry is forbidden. It will be directly destroyed. May the goddess bless us all. Leonard never expected such a development. 7:30 in the evening, at the Oravi Governor-General's office. Klein changed into Sothoth's appearance. He wore a black tailcoat and a bow tie of the same color. He followed Bilt into the banquets hall. The temperature inside was like that of spring. A gigantic chandelier hung from the ceiling, and the shimmering candlelight illuminated the grounds like it was daytime. In the corner on the right, there were musicians dressed in vests and bow ties playing a brisk tune. On the left were long tables. On top were roasted chicken, pan-fried foie gras, stewed lamb, Backlund-styled roasted goose, Odora lobsters with butter and cheese, and other delicacies. Despite the distance, Klein could still catch a whiff of the fragrance wafting over. He planned on getting a plate and filling it with food. At this moment, Bilt tugged at his collar in a reserved manner. He leaned his head over and suppressed his voice. Remember the etiquette as required by such banquets. Our current goal is to observe His Excellency's actions, so just taking a cup of wine would do. There's Misty champagne here, Ormir grape wine, and Southville red wine, all famous alcohols that are seldom seen outside. You can drink some, but not a lot. We have to maintain sufficient sobriety. Yes, try to just go through the motions when drinking. Klein retracted his gaze and nodded. The two of them took a cup of golden champagne, whose minute bubbles were like mist, from a red-vested waiter who passed by them. Then, they moved towards the banquet's highlight, where Amirius Revelt stood wearing his dark blue Navy Admiral's uniform. With their standing, they naturally had no way of approaching the Admiral. All they could do was observe his every action from a slight distance. Amirius's figure is normal. It doesn't look that fit. The corners of his mouth droops a little, indicating his actual age. He doesn't have a beard. His blue eyes seem to hide an authority that one cannot reject or defend against. His dark blue Admiral uniform is starched well. There's a red lanyard at his shoulder, which joins to his chest where there are all sorts of medals. His sleeves have golden cufflinks, accentuating his epaulettes of the same color. His epaulettes are split into 3 parts. From inside out, there's an embedded crown with rubies, the crossed scepter and sword, 4 stars made of diamonds. Klein began scrutinizing and used his faceless powers to memorize all the detailed characteristics of the Navy Admiral, as well as the attitude he used when talking to different people. During this process, he only took a sip of the misty champagne and didn't take note of its taste. After he had mostly gathered all the information, Klein exhaled and allowed his mind to rest. The great drain on his mind made him hungry. Hence, he placed the wine cup on the tray of a red-vested waiter, and he planned to get some food from the long table. At this moment, Bilt leaned over and said, His Excellency has given me the signal. We will be meeting him at an agreed location. Klein retracted his gaze from the roasted chicken and swept a cold glance at Bilt. Bilt shuddered as he hurriedly turned around, leading Gehrman Sparrow from the floor-to-ceiling window and into the garden. After walking for nearly a minute in the secluded path, he paused and pointed at Klein's face. You can change into His Excellency's appearance. Just pretend that you're that tramp who looks like him. Klein nodded gently and extended his palm to wipe his face. He did so to conceal the disgusting tendrils and granules that might appear on his face while changing his appearance. By the time he lowered his palm, Bilt saw a middle-aged gentleman who looked somewhat like Amirius Revelt. Very good. Bilt took a few steps forward and came to the entrance of a sundries room. He extended his hand and pushed open the unlocked door. Amirius Revelt was still wearing the eye-catching admiral's uniform. His body was standing sideways to the door as he observed the garden outside by the window. At this moment, he turned his head and cast his gaze onto the person who resembled him. The indescribable pressure and might made Klein involuntarily lower his head. Amirius Revelt's gaze didn't stop there as it slowly moved to Bilt. He said, without any tinge of emotion, "This isn't the tramp you mentioned before. He's a Beander." Upon hearing Amirius Revelt's descriptive words which weren't a question, Bilt's forehead instantly broke out into a cold sweat. He turned agape, hoping to explain himself, but finally, he plopped to his knees and said under the indescribable pressure, "Admiral, Your Excellency, the tramp from before suddenly died of an illness. I had no choice but to find an adventurer who can shapeshift." At this moment in time, Klein wasn't too nervous. This was because Amirius Revelt had already noticed him during the banquet. There was no reason for him to only recognize him as a Beander only now. For him to agree to their meeting and not directly avoid the risk meant that he didn't mind who Bilt had hired. Not worried at all? This is the confidence of a demigod. Otherwise, his Beander pathway is able to avert disaster ahead of time. Klein raised his head with great difficulty as he cast his gaze towards the Navy Admiral beside him. Quite strong, Amirius Revelt commented without an expression. He continued looking at the genuflecting Bilt and said, "Do not try to use your under-the-table smarts in front of me. An ordinary person and a Beander in this world are different, and I'm a follower of order, making me be able to be certain of this. Of course, it's identical to what's written in the information. This admiral is inclined to expounding on certain things. I have to remember this point. This is a completely different style from me and Gehrman Sparrow." Klein retracted his gaze in thought as he cast it to the ground as if he was unable to withstand the pressure. Amirius Revelt took one step forward. "Lying is the first mistake you committed. Not being cautious is the second. A tramp you spent a great deal of effort on to groom had suddenly died, and all of a sudden, an adventurer who can shapeshift appears in front of you. Don't you find it a coincidence?" "Yes, it's quite coincidental." Klein nearly said the same thing. If not for his confirmation above the grey fog, he would have suspected if he was being set up by a legendary creature or a Grade Zero sealed artifact. Bilt's pupils constricted as he snapped to his senses. He discovered that due to his horror and fear, all he thought about was to grasp at the final life-saving straw. He had lost the caution brought about from his experience, having not considered whether Gehrman Sparrow's appearance was a coincidence or not. The tramp had suddenly died on the day he arrived at the Sweet Lemon Bar. The more Bilt thought about it, the more he felt as though he had fallen for some intricately planned trap. As Amirius Revelt watched Bilt's expression change with enlightenment and regret, he nodded gently and said, "My father, the deceased Earl Revelt, once taught me this. He said to pardon the first mistake of a subordinate. Bilt, you should be thankful for his benevolence." Bilt's tense mood eased instantly as he felt extremely moved. He thought Amirius Revelt, who was closer to a god than man, would execute him on the spot, so as to warn all the adventurers who were under him. Who knew that he would choose to pardon him? "Your Excellency, Bilt was momentarily unable to form a sentence. Amirius maintained his stern expression and said in a deep voice, "There's a second half of the saying, that is, punish them for their second mistake. Bilt, do you know what you should do in the future?" The genuflecting Bilt immediately straightened his back and pressed his right fist to his left chest. "I'll be utmost loyal to you, Your Excellency." Amirius nodded and turned to Klein. "What's your name?" "That depends on which identity you're asking about." Klein lampooned inwardly and calmly replied, "Gehrman Sparrow." Amirius Revelt suddenly fell silent for 2 seconds as the atmosphere in the sundry room seemed to freeze. Just as Klein couldn't help but feel uneasy, Amirius finally said, "So it's you." "Your Excellency, you sound as though you know me." "I'm just an ordinary military informant. I only exchanged some bounty through you. I haven't even made any reimbursement claims." Klein silently mumbled as he felt less and less confident. Amirius nodded and said to Bilt and Klein, "The plan will proceed as per normal. However, we need to sign a contract." "A contract?" Klein resisted the pressure with great difficulty as he raised his head to look at Amirius. Amirius didn't provide a further explanation. He lifted up the paper and pen he had long prepared from the windowsill and wrote something on it. Every time he made contact with his pen, a golden glow would emit. The solemnity and holiness made it seem like he was penning a law. Klein narrowed his eyes slowly as his vision turned blurry. He couldn't help but lower his head again. After an unknown period of time, Amirius stopped writing and picked up a piece of paper. He said to Klein, "Sign your name at the end. If the conditions aren't satisfactory, you can choose not to sign." "Do you think I have or lack the guts to sign it?" Klein lampooned as he watched Bilt stand up. He received the pen and paper and handed it to Klein. The conditions on the piece of paper were few and simple. Most of them restricted Gehrman Sparrow's actions when acting as Amirius Revelt. It included, but wasn't limited to, voluntarily exposing any problems, not using his identity to engage in acts which were adversarial to Amirius, as well as not make any intimate contact with Miss Cynthia, etc. I thought such important figures wouldn't care about the chastity of their mistresses. This admiral is indeed an old-fashioned man. However, I'm not such a person either. Klein hid his curiosity and asked as though it was an academic question, "What if Miss Cynthia chooses to make intimate contact with me?" In between the lines, he was saying that being too distant or resistant made it easier for Cynthia to notice a problem. He was asking how he should balance the act. "It's fine," Amirius said without any expression. "During the contract's validity, you will not have any desire or lack the ability to do it when facing her. You can do that? This contract is rather powerful. Apart from a contract with spirit world creatures, this is the first time I'm seeing other contracts. Furthermore, the former used the power of the underworld. This contract is only between two parties. Is this a demigod beyonder power of Admiral Amirius? The Arbiter Pathway?" Klein shot a glance at the dates and discovered that it lasted 5 days. Is he confident that he will return within 5 days, or is his level only capable of implementing a contract for 5 days? Klein read the conditions once again before taking the fountain pen and wrote the name, Gehrman Sparrow. With the final character written, he saw the words on the piece of paper emit a golden glow as they condensed into a resplendent luster. Amidst the resplendent luster, the piece of paper rapidly dissipated and vanished, as though it had fused with the world's rules. An invisible and faint grey fog gently rippled around him as Klein clearly sensed layers of indescribable restrictions placed on him. These restrictions quickly melted into his body, temporarily becoming one with his spirit body and physical flesh. The grey fog can block out bad and good luck from external sources to a certain extent, but it's unable to screen a contract I signed. That's right. If it can screen it, the contract with the messenger wouldn't have been valid. Klein gazed at Amirius Revelt once again in enlightenment. The admiral had already converged his might as he produced a dark gold charm in his palm. On it were the symbols and magical labels representing the Sword of Judgment. Its entire body was converged and somber, giving one the feeling that it was part of a codex. This is a high-level charm using my blood, a 4th epic ancient codex, and the royal family's Grade 0 sealed artifact, Amirius said calmly. Its name is Ninth Law. When it's injected with minute amounts of spirituality, it can produce a might that's similar to mine. This can be done even by ordinary people. Without it, you'll find it very difficult to pretend to be me. Indeed, the might I show in a disguised state is only superficial. It's fine fooling others usually, but once there's a need to shock and awe any subordinate, that would be useless. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Amirius continued, with your present strength, you should be able to withstand its usage. Through it, you can indicate a necessary restriction on the target, making them be in an extremely disadvantageous state. This way, even if a demigod were to sound you out, you'll be able to scare him away. If no mishaps happen at the end of everything, and if you had no need to use it, then it will be yours to keep. It can be used for a year. Klein was first taken aback before he felt a strong sense of delight. He finally had another high-level charm ever since that time he used up the one which was created with the mutated sun sacred emblem. Although such an item had a time limitation and was single use, a pro was that it didn't have any negative side effects. Of course, the stringent requirements that were needed to create one made them very rare in number. As expected of a demigod. He's a lot more generous than Bilt. Bribing a tramp and an adventurer at the pirate admiral level are different in cost. As Klein thought in happiness, he silently extended his palm and received the high-level charm named Ninth Law. Then, he saw Amirius remove his belt. After a brief silence, Klein kept his embarrassment in control as he took off his clothes without an expression on his face. Soon, he had switched clothes with Amirius and had donned the dark blue starched admiral's uniform. After watching Amirius and Bilt walk off through a secluded path in the garden, Klein calmly adjusted his buttons and turned to look at the glass window. Under the dark night and the crimson moonlight, the glass window was like a mirror. It vaguely reflected Klein's present looks. He had black hair which was neatly combed back, blue and profound eyes, slightly drooping cheeks, a beardless face, and an old-fashioned and stern demeanor, all while dressed in a dark blue attire with a lanyard, medals, and epaulettes. Klein twitched the corners of his mouth as he silently said to himself, "From this moment forth, I'm a Navy admiral." As he touched the Ninth Law charm in his pocket, Klein adjusted his height and details regarding his appearance, making him look identical to Amirius Revelt. He walked out from the sundry room by using another door and walked down a silent corridor, back into the Governor-General's office. On the way, waiters and maid-servants would occasionally pass by him, but no one dared to look straight at him. Just catching sight of his admiral uniform would have them scurrying to the sides as they bowed with their heads lowered. Any person of the same height could probably find his way into the banquet hall when donning these clothes. I have to say, acting as an important figure can be easier than acting like an ordinary person. Klein continued looking straight as he maintained his somber attitude. He walked towards a path paved with black brick in an unhurried fashion. He soon heard beautiful and melodic music as elegant wall lamps were burning with gas, illuminating the dark environment. Just as Klein approached a break room, he saw a room open. A middle-aged man had been waiting there as he walked over. The man had black hair and blue eyes. His facial features somewhat resemble Amirius, but his forehead was higher and his eyebags were puffy. The corners of his mouth didn't droop. He was none other than Amirius Revelt's youngest brother, Aston Revelt. This gentleman had once served in the Navy, and he had been promoted to colonel after rendering meritorious services in the southern continent's colonies. Later, he got sick of his military career, and together with political balance, he agreed to a switch in career and became the Governor-General. In the 5 to 6 years he was in Oravi, due to the importance placed on the island's location and resources, he pushed for the Revelt family to mass-purchase farmland and estates, allowing him to own plenty of property. This wasn't completely obtained through his powers either. Aston and the Revelt family had paid a sufficient price, and they even took loans with the bank. It wasn't like the Balam East Coast where land belonging to the Fasak people were forcefully bought at extremely low prices. Of course, if he wasn't Governor-General, then Oravi and his elder brother wouldn't be the highest commander of the Central Sonia Seas Navy, and the Revelt family wouldn't have so easily convinced their targets to sell such excellent farmland and estates. Here comes the test. Klein calmly approached and stopped in front of Aston Revelt. Aston looked around and asked in a deep voice, "Have you decided on that matter?" "What matter?" Klein first felt blank before he recalled an introduction in the information he received. If Aston requests for a private chat or asks for an answer to a certain matter, tell him that an answer will be given to him when departing from Oravi. Admiral Amirius really anticipated this. I just need to watch my attitude and tone. Yes, I also need to use the unique terms and pronunciations used by Loan aristocrats. Klein gently nodded and sternly said, "Wait a few more days. The answer will be given to you when departing from Oravi." Aston didn't raise any doubts as he chuckled. "You seem to be waiting for something to give you the strength to decide. That matter that Admiral Amirius has to do himself?" Klein's heart stirred as he familiarly used the tone of high-level personnel. "Keep your conjectures to yourself." With that said, he took a step forward and walked towards the banquet hall. Aston Revelt focused on his elder brother's back, his expression gradually turning cold. He then shook his head slightly. After entering the banquet hall, Klein surveyed the area and walked towards the long table with food on it. From time to time, he would stop to exchange pleasantries with people who came near him. During this process, he realized that he didn't need to understand the topics raised in any conversation. All he needed to do was nod occasionally, allowing the conversation to harmoniously progress until its end. Indeed, the status of an important figure makes certain aspects of acting easy, but correspondingly, there are certain matters that can be difficult. Klein tore through one obstacle after another before finally arriving at the long table. He casually picked up a plate and told himself that Admiral Amirius liked fish, beef, and lobster, while disliking chicken and goose. Therefore, he avoided food like the roasted chicken and Backlund-styled roasted goose. He picked up some beef, fried dragonbone fish, and Odora lobster with butter and cheese. As the metallic containers had their bottoms lined with asbestos, with red-hot charcoal burning under it or steaming hot water, all of the food maintained an appropriate temperature. Klein nearly broke down, destroying his persona when he took the first bite. He tried his best to maintain Admiral Amirius's image as he held his plate and chatted with the port city's Member of Parliament, Navy suppliers, etc. He seriously listened to what they had to say, stuffing food into his mouth from time to time. He noticed that a young man in a tailcoat kept following behind him. He had neat, blonde hair that he combed backward. He had a receding hairline with light blue eyes. He looked handsome and gentlemanly. Identical to the picture. Amirius's secretary, Luann. Klein controlled himself and didn't size him up. He wanted to fill his stomach before the end of the banquet. Once out of the Governor-General's office, Klein boarded the carriage which was guarded by bodyguards. He sat beside the wine cabinet. The blonde secretary, Luann, followed him in. As his leather boots stepped onto the thick, soft carpet, he silently inched towards a spot opposite Klein. He sat there, but he only occupied a third of the seat. The carriage began moving as Luann took out a stack of documents from the black briefcase he carried. Your Excellency, this is the Oravi Naval Base's ledger for the year 1349. Klein extended his hand over and casually browsed through a few pages. What? £1 for a roll of toilet paper? The Naval Base's bathroom was renovated 20 times a year? Klein did some simple math and discovered all sorts of ridiculous line items. Isn't accounting such as this way too simple and obvious? I can even give them classes and specially teach them how to make claims. Klein seriously considered the attitude he should show. From his point of view, the greatest difficulty in disguising as Amirius was to fool Luann. This wasn't to say that Governor-General Aston and Miss Cynthia weren't as familiar with Admiral Amirius as his secretary. It was just that, as his younger brother, Aston might help his brother conceal the matter if he discovered something amiss after being given a hint. Similarly, as his mistress, Cynthia would be inclined to help conceal the matter for the Admiral as his dependent. Of course, the possibility that Cynthia was a spy couldn't be eliminated. There was still the matter of there being a chance of being used by a spy, but nothing could be as dangerous as Luann, whose duty was to monitor the Admiral. I can't expose any problems. What kind of attitude would Admiral Amirius have when faced with such a report? Go into a rage, or pretend to be in a rage? No, the Oravi Naval Base personnel wouldn't be that daring to hand over a clearly problematic report as though he were blind. They must have a certain level of confidence and a tacit understanding between them. As the information didn't mention this, Klein could only make a judgment based on his experience. Furthermore, he could confirm that either the Oravi Naval Base's report was beyond Admiral Amirius's expectations or was determined to be of little importance. Just based on the schedule, it was something that could easily be dealt with. Regardless of the possibilities, I have to use the attitude that a person of high standing will usually employ. That is to not indicate my stance. Klein closed the documents and handed it back to the blonde secretary, Luann. He said expressionlessly, "Put it on my desk." In between the lines, this sentence meant, "I'll look through it carefully." To others, it would mean something different based on their standpoints. If the Oravi Naval Base had done it without warning, this meant that the Admiral was somewhat dissatisfied and was awaiting an explanation. If the two had reached a tacit, mutual understanding on the matter, it meant that Admiral Amirius wished to obtain more favorable benefits in the matter. As for whether it would offend anyone, Klein didn't care. After all, he wouldn't be Amirius Reveldt in a few days' time. He believed that a true demigod had the means to repress the anger of his subordinates. In addition, he was grateful that Amirius wasn't a demigod of the Church of Storms. Otherwise, he had to consider whether to nod his head and pass the report, or throw the document back in anger while throwing a few people in passing into the sea to feed the fishes. Yes, Your Excellency. The blonde secretary, Luann, didn't change his expression. He stuffed the document back into his black briefcase as though he had long expected such a response. On the way back, Klein leaned into the carriage according to Amirius Reveldt's habits. He half closed his eyes as though he was contemplating certain matters, but in fact, he wasn't thinking of anything. Luann maintained his silence and didn't speak at all. Human-height iron black street lamps were quickly left behind as the carriage drove close to the naval base before taking a bend into a house with a garden and lawn. Just as Klein walked up the steps, a butler opened the door for him as servants lined the two sides, reverently awaiting his entrance. The living room was decorated in a very classic manner. There were oil paintings of beautiful scenery hung up, limestone statues, simple and elegant vases, etc. A faint but lingering fragrance emanated in the room, one that reached into the heart. Klein, who should have relaxed, ended up tensing up as he saw a beautiful lady walk towards him in a home gown. She looked to be in her early 20s. Her blonde hair cascaded down, and when she cast her blue eyes over, it was as though there was a glow hidden within them. While filled with gentle feminineness, there were still some remnants of her youth. She was none other than Admiral Amirius's mistress, Cynthia. Klein held back his discomfort and allowed Amirius's stern face to reveal a smile as he widened his arms. Cynthia threw herself into his arms and tiptoed. With her cheeks by his cheek, she whispered with a smile, "Admiral, I've already heated the water for you in the bathtub." This means she had someone monitor the end of the banquet. Being a mistress isn't something simple either. Admiral Amirius does like to take hot baths so as to relax his thoughts. In order to ignore how close their cheeks were, Klein allowed his thoughts to wander. As a straight man, he should have felt embarrassed while also being rather glad to be approached by such a beautiful member of the opposite sex. However, the temporary contract made him have zero urges. Hence, all that was left was awkwardness. Very good, Klein praised her as he gently pushed Cynthia away, having had nowhere to place them. Knowing that the Admiral didn't like to be intimate in front of the servants, Cynthia retreated and led Klein to the second floor. He was brought into the bathroom as he prepared a bathrobe for him. After doing all of this, Cynthia instructed the servants not to come to the second floor unless they heard the bell ring. Then, she returned to the bedroom, took off all her clothes and changed into a nightgown made of silk. Her nightgown revealed plenty of her chest. It was an alluring snow white, and deep in her cleavage was a special necklace pendant. It was like a miniaturized black rhinoceros horn about the length of a finger segment. Cynthia took off the necklace and stuffed it under her pillow. Amidst her blushing and hesitation, she left the bedroom and came outside the bathroom where the Admiral was bathing. Mustering her strength, she pulled at the handle. Creak. Her hand paused. She realized that the bathroom's door had been locked from the inside at some point in time. With a blank look, Cynthia instinctively yanked at it again. Creak. Creak. The bathroom's door didn't budge an inch. The bathroom was partitioned inside. The emanating steam covered the entire bathtub. Apart from his head, Klein's entire body was soaked in the hot water. He lay there in such great comfort that he didn't even wish to move his toes. What a beautiful night. If only there was no Cynthia outside. I still have to deal with her later. Klein sighed as he considered what excuse to use to avoid being intimate with her. In accordance with Admiral Amirius Revelt's traits, he decided to first use work as an excuse. After that would be the excuse of him not feeling well, him losing the ability to have sex, him needing some time to digest any medicine he had just taken, and how he had suddenly realized his true sexual orientation, making him find curly-haired baboons extremely attractive. As for whether this would damage the Admiral's image, Klein didn't feel the slightest bit of pressure. As long as he prevented Cynthia from suspecting that he was a fake Amirius Revelt, he would have perfectly completed his mission. The subsequent explanations for those excuses and how he finds an excuse to explain his recovery would all be Admiral Amirius's problem. What has that got to do with me, Gehrman Sparrow? And what has Gehrman Sparrow's ruined reputation have to do with me, Sherlock Moriarty? Klein stood up in satisfaction as he walked out to the dry partition while dropping wet. He got a bath towel and dried himself. After changing into a hanging bathrobe, Klein inhaled silently as though he had unlocked a major enemy in his quest. He opened the door to the bathroom. Seeing the corridor empty, with only the light from the wall lamps on both sides illuminating the darkness, Klein felt slightly relieved and was no longer as tensed. This is almost the same feeling as challenging a pirate admiral. As he mumbled, he realized a serious problem. He had no idea which of the rooms was the master bedroom or study. Regardless, I have to inform Cynthia. Otherwise, it would make Admiral Amirius appear strange. Klein recalled the layout of similar houses in an attempt to accurately find the master bedroom. At this moment, the door to the room diagonally across him creaked open. Cynthia, who was draped in a silk nightgown, walked over. Her blonde hair appeared wet and messy as they cascaded down. There were even a few strands of hair fluttering in front of her blue eyes and bright red lips. It hid the glow in her eyes as her lips were somewhat closed. She appeared extremely alluring under the dim environment. The neckline of the silk nightgown was very open, as snow-whiteness and a deep cleavage was reflected in Klein's eyes. Klein nearly raised his head to look at the ceiling to avoid the intense stimulation. Calm down, calm down. You are Amirius Revelt. Besides, you've seen a half-naked demoness before. Compared to an ailment maiden, this lady's charms are clearly insufficient. Wait, why am I thinking about demonesses? Who knows if they were formerly men or women? Klein maintained his gaze as he sized her up and down with a teasing tone. In that instant, he could sense that primal desire, but there was no response from his nether regions. This is the result of the temporary contract? In fact, Admiral Amirius didn't need to go through the trouble. Even if I have the urge, I'll be able to control myself. What kind of situation haven't I encountered before? Yes, Cynthia is a little different from what the records say. Isn't it said that she became Amirius's mistress about 1 to 2 years ago? With them not being able to meet each other most of the time, the Admiral has to coax her each time as she hadn't had her pent-up desires fulfilled? Why is she the one taking the initiative today? Does she find her standing as his mistress unstable, or has she been switched? Ever since Klein became a faceless, he felt that everyone was a fake. Cynthia's eyelids were lowered. The courage she had mustered disappeared bit by bit under Amirius's scrutiny. Her face was tainted with a horrified blush. She was embarrassed but also felt some pride. Then, she heard him calmly instruct, "Help me prepare some coffee and place it in my study. I have many things to deal with tonight. You don't have to wait for me." Quote. Cynthia raised her head suddenly, her embarrassed blushing still present. She had momentarily failed to understand what Admiral Amirius had said. Klein secretly inhaled and went forward to hug her before kissing her gently on the forehead. "I'll spend lots of time with you in a few days." Such a response came from the provided information, but he had slightly changed the terms. To be frank, if not for him having some prior understanding, Klein would have definitely believed that Admiral Amirius would wear the same stoic face while spending time with his mistress, even when having sex. He looked stern in whatever he said and did. However, this demigod also had his gentle side when it came to his speech. He was just not that great at saying lovey-dovey words. This also made him understand something else. Many people could only be viewed from the surface, and it was impossible to imagine what they were like in private. For a faceless to pull off a true disguise, they had to do meticulous investigations and have ample comprehension of the target. This was just like how a magician never performed unprepared. Cynthia revealed a clear look of disappointment, but she quickly restrained those feelings as she smiled. "All right, Admiral, your nightgown is in the room. A bathrobe isn't suitable for handling matters. This is identical to the information. She's rather considerate and knows how to be understanding." Klein watched as Cynthia turned and entered the room. She pulled at the bell. As for him, he took this opportunity to take off his bathrobe and change into a dark red nightgown with trousers of the same color. Cynthia attentively opened the door to the study and tidied up the slightly messy desk. Later, she waited for the maidservant to finish making the coffee before personally taking it and delivering it by hand. During this process, Klein read the documents and information, acting as though he looked extremely professional. But in fact, he had little idea about the data and designs plans of ironclad warships and sail battleships. He was no different from an illiterate. In this domain, all he knew were carriers, air domination, the main cannon guns, and turrets. When he saw Cynthia silently leave and close the door behind her from the corner of his eye, Klein relaxed completely. He knew that he had finally survived the night. Inside the master bedroom, Cynthia pursed her lips as she took out the necklace under her pillow and tightly clasped the item resembling a black rhinoceros horn which was the length of a finger segment. She stood there and silently prayed, "O great mother tree of desire, please, make me more alluring, allowing Admiral Amirius to be even more mesmerized by me, so that he can gain extreme pleasure from me and bear me a child." Inside the quiet study, Klein flipped through the pile of documents placed in front of him. He followed the handling methods according to what the information indicated. He chose the simple ones and signed Amirius Revelt's name on them. The reason why he could mimic his signature was because Faceless allowed him to remember a target's unique traits, while Clown gave him the precise control needed. The complicated ones he couldn't understand had notes written with the following vibe: "Continue studying the matter." After busying himself until midnight, Klein reached out to cover his mouth and yawned slightly. "This won't do. I need to sleep. I have plenty of challenges tomorrow. I have to maintain sufficient strength and energy." Klein thought for a moment and gave up the idea of returning to the master bedroom. He raised his right hand and pressed down on his half-closed eyes. He pulled them down and moved his eyes to his nose bridge. Following that, Klein opened up 2 slits where Klein's eyes originally were and used his flesh to produce a pair of fake eyes. After becoming a faceless, I'm really beginning to resemble a monster. If only I had such a godly technique back in school. He sighed silently. He half-leaned his body as he kept his real eyes closed while his fake eyes were left open to read the documents. His specialty as a clown allowed him to maintain his balance. He remained motionless like a stone statue. After an unknown period of time, Klein suddenly awoke from his dream. He sensed that there was a force attempting to pull him into a deep slumber before infiltrating him. Who is it? I didn't do anything recently. Why would anyone enter my dream? That's not right. I'm now Admiral Emirius Revelt. Klein's heart stirred as he immediately changed his looks. Even in his dreams, he appeared to be that demigod. Meanwhile, he felt his consciousness tightly contract as though it was avoiding something. This is different from an ordinary dream infiltration. I've clearly regained my lucidity, and I can escape by myself and wake up, but I'm unable to leave this dreamscape. Klein found plenty of oddities as he tried a few attempts. He knew very well that he was sleeping, and he could sense and control his body outside the dream, but no matter what he did, he was unable to wake up. Right on the heels of that, he saw a blurry white gas form an indiscernible figure. Klein narrowed his eyes slightly as he tore through the dream with his psyche, allowing his real body to move silently. Then, he put his palm into his pocket to touch the 9th law charm. At that moment, the blurry figure calmly said, "Do not participate in the matter regarding Aston." This is a warning. Ellipsis. Quite impressive to warn a demigod. What is Aston and the others thinking of doing? Klein thought for a moment and emanated his spirituality, allowing the 9th law charm to produce a deep sense of dominance. Then, he imitated it and produced the same feeling in his dream. He said with a deep voice, "Who are you? Who do you represent?" The blurry figure was taken aback before he said with a laughing sigh, as expected of Law Weaver Emirius. "You actually managed to maintain your lucidity in such a situation." No. Although Emirius has a title of Law Weaver, he's not adept in such matters. "You should say, as expected of Lord Fool," Klein lampooned and sternly said. "Answer my question." The blurry figure chuckled. "You don't need to know who I am. As a demigod, you should be clear that everything is fated, likewise for the times. Do not resist the fate of an era, which is also the trend of the times. This will only make you a sacrifice of history. Fate of an era, the trend of the times, sacrifice of history." When he heard this, Klein suddenly thought of a term, Twilight Hermit Order. However, Klein didn't say a word, nor did he say those words. This was because Admiral Emirius would be him for the next few days. Seeing Law Weaver Emirius fall into silence, the blurry figure didn't say another word. It turned into a emanating white gas before vanishing from the dream. Phew! What exactly are Emirius and Aston Revelt scheming about? To attract a warning from the Twilight Hermit Order. Unless it can truly change the times and influence the direction of history, this ancient and secretive organization wouldn't even show itself or reveal its identity. Klein stood by the side of a magnificent castle in his dream, thoughtfully watching the spot where the blurry figure had disappeared from. Amidst his thoughts, he suddenly snapped awake and was no longer as certain about his theory. The ploy which Admiral Emirius and his brother are planning might not really influence the trends of the times. Although the Twilight Hermit Order only involves itself in important matters, as a leader of another secret organization, Klein clearly knew that apart from carrying out the organization's own mission and values, it also provided help among members. From Emperor Rassel's diary, I can tell that the Twilight Hermit Order has members from different domains, standings, and sequences. Apart from a number of them fervently believing in the original creator as they await the coming of Twilight and the awakening of the true God, the rest are only seeking to benefit themselves. Under such circumstances, as long as the organizer doesn't strictly implement order, there would naturally be missions entrusted between one another. Perhaps the matter Aston Revelt is planning affects a particular member of the Twilight Hermit Order who was made aware of it ahead of time. He entrusted the matter to another member and used the excuse of the trend of the times to warn Emirius Revelt. Working from this logic, the concealed matter is rather interesting. With the level of the Twilight Hermit Order, Law Weaver Emirius, who's likely only a sequence 4, isn't too difficult a target to eliminate. I even suspect that they can mobilize up to 3 or more angels in a manner that's far superior to the 7 churches. Then, why didn't they take action directly and instead gave an advanced warning? Back in Backland, if an angel were to appear, who knows if some true god would descend upon the land. Therefore, the Twilight Hermit Order had no choice but to use a more roundabout and discreet method to deal with Duke Negan. But this is the Oravi Island. Even high-sequence Beyonders aren't stationed here. The warning is because the Twilight Hermit Order advocates secrecy and doesn't wish to expose itself, so they're trying not to use overly intense methods. Or is it the case that the member who assigned the mission doesn't wish to see Amirius killed? To him, this admiral is still of use, so he's unwilling to give up on him, even if Amirius might be involved in something disadvantageous towards him. Then, his true identity seems to be confined to certain circles. Klein made a bold assumption, but with no way of verifying it, he could only temporarily put the matter aside and throw it to the back of his mind. It has nothing to do with me since it's the Twilight Hermit Order who's warning Admiral Amirius. As long as I don't involve myself with anything for the next few days, I should be able to last until the mission is completed. Everything else that develops afterward has nothing to do with me. With my present status, I'm still far from investigating the Twilight Hermit Order. I don't even have the right to probe deeper. Klein kept to his beliefs and turned his sights to his tarot club. Hey, I just discovered a problem. Other secret organizations have their own aims and values at their core while mixing in the aid that members provide each other. As for our tarot club, it's more impressive. There are only missions given to each other, without any aims or values. No, there are aims and values among some of the members. For example, my dear Moon believes that this is an organization born to save the world. The fool Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh before exiting the dreamscape. He rubbed away the fake eyes and moved his real eyes back to their original position in a very fluid motion when he suddenly paused. That wasn't a simple dream infiltration. Klein frowned slightly as he recalled what had happened. That was because the power had first attempted to pull him into a deep slumber. Back then, I had already fallen asleep, so why would he do so? Captain once said that a nightmare can directly see a dream, so it's impossible to commit such a mistake. Therefore, the visitor hadn't used the Beyonder powers of a nightmare, but something else. He located me via the spirit world? Or after he knew my location, he used the Sea of Collective Subconscious, as described by Ma'am Daly, to directly influence my Beyonder powers? Yes, I'm more inclined to the second reason. That's the only thing that can explain why I couldn't escape my dream despite having regained lucidity. It's recorded in Emperor Russell's diary that during his participation in the suspected Twilight Hermit Order, his entry into the gathering was based on a realistic dreamscape that encompassed the entire continent. A realistic dreamscape. Klein nodded and chuckled silently with a sigh. Admiral Amirius definitely didn't expect the Twilight Hermit Order's warning. It's only because he hired me. If it were anyone else, the stand-in would have already been exposed. That ninth law charm was well worth it. City of Silver, inside the spire, in the room belonging to Chief Colin Iliad. Derek Berg, who had been summoned, saw the grizzled, scarred demon hunter once again as he felt uneasy. After he finished his greetings, Colin sized him up and asked, "You've advanced?" "Yes, I'm already a Sequence 7 Solar High Priest." Derek had long registered his advancement, so there was no need to hide the matter. Colin's light blue eyes, which had seen the vicissitudes of time, moved away as he casually asked, "Do you have the subsequent potion formulas?" The past Derek would have directly answered, no, but the present him was used to thinking over it before answering. If I say, no, my subsequent advancement with the lack of experience to support it will definitely make me suspicious. But if I were to answer, yes, Chief might ask me to use it to exchange for items so as to nurture more Sun Pathway Beyonders. This will no doubt prove that I'm lying. As Derek's mind raced, he answered sincerely, no. From his point of view, experience could be forged. Colin nodded as if nothing was out of the ordinary. In about 2 months, we'll arrange an exploration mission for you. The team will secure the root and ruins we found with the help of Jack before we make a second clearing. I hope you will receive greater rewards then. Yes, Your Excellency. Just as Derek answered, he suddenly recalled Shepherd Lovia. After daybreak, Klein changed into his clothes with the help of Cynthia, enjoyed a sumptuous breakfast, and took the carriage under the escort of the Admiral's bodyguards to the Oravi Naval Base. In the morning, under the companionship of the rear admirals and colonels, he inspected the conditions of the ships, ordnance stores, the newly built training grounds, and the bathroom which had been renovated 20 times over the past year. After having lunch at the Navy mess hall, Klein followed the schedule and summoned all officers above the rank of major to take in their reports. During this process, he had a thick black-bound notebook placed in front of him. Inside were some of the questions that Admiral Amirius had specially prepared for him. In the past few decades, due to the embezzlement of salaries and the harsh conditions sailors suffer, Oravi has had 17 revolts by the lower ranks. After the passing of the Imperial Navy latest act, and thanks to Your Excellency's guidance, we've already had such deep-seated cultural issues improved. There haven't been any such cases in the past 3 years. A colonel from the Oravi naval base stood on the spot and reported the entire situation. He would raise his head from time to time to look at Admiral Amirius Revelt and discovered that he was listening very seriously while taking notes. The scribbling sounds made none of the officers dare to not be at their best. Similarly, they took note of the important points. The colonel who received a positive response unknowingly spoke up louder while reporting. How boring. Klein held his fountain pen and had randomly drawn creatures like turtles, cuttlefish, and dragons on his black-bound notebook. As he had never studied sketching before, his drawings were a ghastly sight to see. Later on, he even drew intersecting lines and began playing 5 in a row with himself, a game created by Emperor Russell. Of course, his rich experience and his conscientiousness of his identity made him raise his head from time to time to give the reporter a stern look in the eye while giving a nod of encouragement. As for what the person had said, he didn't pay any attention to it. All he did was occasionally remember a few words. During the briefing, Klein shot a glance at the blonde secretary, Luann, to get him to represent himself to mention a few points that needed clarification. Everything followed the schedule. Towards the end, Klein flipped the black-bound notebook a few pages forward and used the accent of a Loan aristocrat to recite the report which the secretary had drafted and the admiral had edited. Then, according to the actual situation, he used the common terms Amirius would use and added a few conjunctions and pet phrases, such as, there are a few points, and, let me continue on a few more points. It was already evening by the time the briefing ended. Under Luann's companionship, Klein left the Oravi naval base and headed for the residence of a naval supplier where a banquet was held. At the banquet, they casually chatted about the price fluctuations of port goods. As for Klein, he mimicked Admiral Amirius, and he would mention a dated joke from Backland from time to time, garnering a warm response from everyone as he was praised for his humor. After successfully acting until the banquet ended, Klein boarded the carriage, feeling exhausted in body and mind. I have to take note of my speech and actions every minute and second. Engaging in true acting for a day is more tiring than battling a pirate admiral. Klein silently sighed, as he closed his eyes halfway without a change in expression. He knew that the most difficult stage of the day wasn't over. He still had to deal with Cynthia. Ellipsis. Inside the villa, Cynthia learned from the attendant who had gone out to make inquiries that Admiral Amirius was about to return. She quietly returned to her bedroom, took out the tiny black rhinoceros horn pendant, and used a metallic plate to scratch off tiny bits of powder, mixing it into the hot water inside a white porcelain teacup. After repeating the honorific name of the Mother Tree of Desire 7 times, she waited nearly a minute before lifting the teacup in hope, cleanly downing it. Looking at the lights emanating out from the villa in the darkness, Klein spent several seconds mentally preparing himself before alighting the carriage. He followed the 3-layered staircase and came to the door, where the admiral's bodyguards and servants were lined up at the sides, before stepping in. Seeing Cynthia wearing conservative home clothes due to the existence of others, Klein silently heaved a sigh of relief as he maintained his stoic expression and slowly walked over. Cynthia's smile became more and more brilliant as she shifted the strands of her hair to the back of her ear, revealing her fair and slender neck. Her neckline didn't have any marks left behind by a necklace. Seeing Secretary Luann and the Admiral's bodyguards head for their own rooms or moving outside the building to take up their patrolling positions, Klein pulled Cynthia into an embrace and said in a deep voice, "There's no need to prepare any hot water. Give me a quiet room. I need to spend the night alone." Cynthia used her eyes to express her puzzlement and blankness. Klein surveyed his surroundings and softly said, "Something unexpected happened. I need to enter an extremely quiet state to recover." As he spoke, he raised his right hand to pull at his collar, revealing a patch of faint-colored fleshy granules. His problematic physical condition with an abnormal reaction was an excuse Admiral Amirius had prepared for the tramp stand-in, so as to avoid Cynthia's attempts of intimacy without exposing a problem. To make it more convincing, Klein used his faceless powers to provide evidence. Cynthia turned agape as she nearly screamed. Thankfully, she covered her mouth in time and held it in. The moment Cynthia recovered from her shock, she immediately asked nervously, her concern and emotions evident, "Are you fine? Do you need to see a doctor?" No, this is the price needed for powerful strength. I'll recover given 2 to 3 days of solitude. Klein had already found the excuse needed for the future. Oh, okay. Cynthia hurriedly helped Klein up to the second floor and led him into the quietest room. As for the master bedroom, she had already lit some scented candles and scattered some faint-smelling extract, so she didn't offer him some. Seeing the door close, Klein slowly exhaled. He changed out of his admiral's uniform and lied down in satisfaction. Not far away in the master bedroom, the worried and disappointed Cynthia was soaking herself in hot water before sleeping. She looked at the ceiling with an unfocused gaze as she couldn't help but recall the exhortations of her parents from a few days ago. They wanted her to charm Admiral Amerius and hopefully be impregnated with his child. This way, their family would be able to take on more businesses with the Central Sonia Seas naval fleet. Admiral seems to have many matters hidden in his heart, so much that something abnormal has happened to his body. Cynthia's thoughts wandered as they slowly dispersed. Without her realizing it, she had fallen asleep. During this period, she found her digestive system turning warm as her body felt a little hot. In her dream, she seemed to see a pitch-black sky which was dotted with resplendent stars. One of them seemed to notice her gaze as it produced a brighter glow. Ellipsis. The next morning, the invigorated Klein enjoyed a sumptuous breakfast which was nothing spectacular to speak of. Once again, he was surrounded by the Admiral's bodyguards as he arrived at the Oravi Naval Base and was placed in the most luxurious and spacious office. According to Admiral Amerius's habits, he would spend some alone time every 2 or 3 days to study and master his Beyonder powers to a deeper extent and produce more effective techniques. Therefore, Klein spent most of the day without being disturbed, with him only needing to handle some simple work. Inside the quiet and spacious office, Klein leisurely paced about or flipped through books from the bookshelf. From time to time, he would put his palm into his pockets to touch the ninth law charm to release some of its powerful might. This was to make Secretary Luan, who was outside, believe that there was nothing wrong with Admiral Amerius. After some time, Klein felt sleepy and decided to take a short nap. At this moment, he heard knocking at the door. There's something important. Klein frowned. Something that made Secretary Luan disturb Admiral Amerius's focused training was definitely nothing simple. Come in. Klein converged his emotions and answered with a deep voice. The handsome blonde man, Luan, turned the handle and entered. He held a telegram in his hand. He said with a suppressed voice, Your Excellency, a telegram from Backlund. Mr. Aston has been relieved of his post as Governor-General. He will temporarily be replaced by the City Council's chairman. It's said that the new Governor-General will arrive today. Aston Revelt has been relieved of his post as Governor-General? Has their secret been discovered? That's right. The Twilight Hermit Order has already warned me. No, Amerius. It means that they had long grasped the actual matter. With another member cranking the wheel, the matter will likely go through a series of position changes, putting an end to the matter. A warning was given the previous night, and action was taken today. They must have prepared for quite a while. Yes, that can be seen from the fact that the new Governor-General will arrive today. Klein was first alarmed before he felt that the matter was within reason. He mimicked the attitude Admiral Amerius would have when faced with a major problem by pacing back and forth before saying with a stern expression, I'm aware. Klein didn't express his views or pass any orders, appearing extremely staid. However, it was because he hadn't decided on a response. We have a saying from the Futaholic Empire, moving is not as good as staying put. I wonder if Russell had translated this. Klein lampooned as he gave a self-deprecating jest. Luan raised his head and glanced at Admiral Amerius without saying a word before silently leaving the office. Phew, Klein paced about once again as he considered what Admiral Amerius would do if he were standing here. This was something important that had happened outside of his expectations. Therefore, Klein could only infer from Amerius's character, experiences, as well as some of the personal descriptions in the information provided to him. He's a conservative person. Even while he was a mid- and low-sequence Beyonder and was on all kinds of different ships, he very rarely took risks. He believes himself to be a Loan aristocrat who values family, children, and emotions. He's a gentleman who's of good bearing and garners the affection of women. This point is open to debate. With his standing and status, even a curly-haired baboon would garner the affection of men and women, no, perhaps even more. At the very least, a curly-haired baboon doesn't tell dated jokes. Information ran through Klein's mind as they intertwined to form a multifaceted image of Admiral Amerius. While in his deep thought, he heard knocking at his door once again. Come in. Klein instantly tensed up. Luann entered and pointed outside. Your Excellency, Mr. Aston wishes to meet you. Why is Aston here? He came to Amerius to seek his protection? Or does he plan on making a desperate struggle? Klein narrowed his eyes slightly, realizing that he couldn't make a decision for Admiral Amerius. What would he do? After receiving a warning from the Twilight Hermit Order, he should already realize that the matter has been exposed. The target was long prepared, so with his conservative nature, it can be imagined that his decision would be. However, he greatly values family. He even provided some of Aston Revelt's interesting tidbits. It's not hard to tell that there's the concern and love for his younger brother in this matter. He doesn't like cannabis and tobacco. Drinking is just for socializing purposes. Apart from being a little caught up with beautiful women, there's nothing seriously wrong with him. He greatly values family. Family. Klein's thoughts raced as he fully immersed himself in Amerius's identity, fully experiencing his hidden feelings for his family and the importance he placed on it. Family. At that instant, he seemed to turn into Amerius, but he was able to analyze the various problems in a detached manner. After nearly 20 seconds of silence, Klein heard himself using a somewhat unfamiliar tone, saying, "Tell him that I have many matters to deal with. I don't have the time to meet him. Also, buy him a ticket back to Backland." Luann seemed to have expected it as he retracted his gaze and replied, as though everything was normal, "Yes, Your Excellency." As he watched Luann leave the office to find Aston Revelt outside, Klein gently sighed like the real Amerius Revelt. He knew that Amerius would have made the same choice if he had returned early. This was family, something he valued greatly. With their scheme completely exposed, there was no way Amerius would have exhausted his last chip on a bet and place his family at risk of destruction. As long as he didn't participate in it, and as long as he's still a demigod, the Revelt family wouldn't suffer any overly serious damage even if he isn't able to remain as the highest commander of Central Sonia Sea. And to get his secretary to buy his tickets for him made it clear that Amerius still treated Aston as his brother. It was a warning to others not to harm him before they figured out what was happening. After nearly a minute, Luann returned and said, "Your Excellency, Mr. Aston has left. Amerius greatly values family." Klein fell silent for 2 seconds before asking in a deep voice, his back facing his secretary, "Did he say anything?" Luann answered truthfully, "He said that you are indeed a cold person by nature." The corners of Klein's lips curled slightly as he produced an unfeeling smile. This was an instinctive reaction. However, with him completely in character as Amerius, he believed that the Admiral would have had the same reaction. The feeling and emotions were the same. For the rest of the time, Klein sat in his office and didn't meet anyone, nor did he deal with any official business. All he did was occasionally listen to his secretary report to him about the situation on Oravi Island. Nothing happened until the arrival of the new Governor-General. In the evening, he didn't attend the banquet he was supposed to attend, and he returned to his villa. As he saw Cynthia walk towards him, he hugged her. Then, he calmly said, "Aston has been relieved of his post as Governor-General." All his sighs and pain seemed to be condensed into that seemingly emotionless sentence. "I heard about it. It should be fine, right?" Cynthia asked anxiously. Klein closed his eyes and didn't mention it again. All he did was give soft, terse reply. That sentence was the most obvious expression of his emotions as a stern, old-fashioned, and conservative high-ranking man. Cynthia could vaguely sense the deep pain and helplessness inside Admiral Amerius's heart. Without speaking further, she hugged him tightly and used her company to calm his mood. After a simple dinner, Klein took a hot bath and entered the quietest guest room once again. He got into bed and stared at the ceiling in a daze. Klein knew that with him having fully immersed himself in the character of Admiral Amerius, Amerius's helplessness towards fate and the pain he needed to hide had resonated with his past experiences. If I hadn't figured out the concept of getting into character and being detached, then I might have lost myself. Heh, this is like some actors in my past life. They get too into character and are unable to detach themselves from it, causing them to suffer from mental problems. And to a Beyander, mental problems might end up magnified. As Klein wallowed in his gloom, he got to learn what kind of person he was. I never expected that a Navy admiral who enjoys a high standing, a demigod saint, would still be faced with such helpless and painful experiences. Strength can bring abundance, but it's not a solution to everything. Everyone wears masks, and this is the truest side of a demigod. Klein watched as the crimson moonlight turned brighter, dyeing all the furniture in the room red. At that moment, through the resonating feelings with Admiral Amirius's experience and the contrasting differences, as well as the experience from his previous acting, Klein established a more multifaceted and realistic image of Amirius. He also gained a clearer picture of his blurry self. A person who's very sentimental. A person from Earth, but to a certain extent, a person who has been reconstructed into a new person because of the fusion with Klein Moretti's memory fragments. A person who didn't spend too much time with the Nighthawks but has had that period of time deeply influence his actions and choices. A person who tries to play safe and is afraid of danger but is able to change his mind at the critical moment. A person who truly wants to skive, eat delicious food, travel, and enjoy life, but he has no choice but to be busy with more important matters. A person who likes beautiful women, but he doesn't give himself up to pleasure to keep to his principles. A person who loves money but is willing to spend large sums of money for his siblings. A person who hides his pain inside while showing a smile to others. A person who's used to lampooning inwardly but appears gentlemanly on the surface. A person who can overcome his psychological traumas but never crosses his bottom line. A person who feels embarrassed for his acting. He's also a guardian, a miserable wretch that is constantly fighting against threats and madness. The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he silently added. These thoughts flashed through his mind as he seemed to come into contact with his true self. Without realizing it, Klein fell asleep, his body and mind at peace. Inside the master bedroom, Cynthia had also fallen asleep. She was dressed in a nightgown with her legs bare. She had a few layers of her blanket in between her legs as she gently grinded against them. Her hand subconsciously scratched her skin, forming red streaks across them as tiny bumps were produced. In her dream, she saw the illusory and surreal sea of stars, as well as that bright star that emitted its light at her. Her vision was pulled closer to it as she could slowly discern the star. Phew! Klein suddenly awoke from his dream as he still had an indescribable scene still seemingly burned into his eyes. Why did I have such a dream? He frowned as he turned his head in disbelief. Just now, not only had he dreamed of Cynthia, who was dressed in a silk nightgown, but he also had a sexual relationship with her. He even dreamed of the naked body of Demoness of Pleasure Sharon, the exquisite doll-like Miss Sharon, Miss Justice whose looks were relatively blurry, Trissa Cheek, Tracy, and all the beautiful women he had met before. Then, he gave himself up to pleasure as he engaged in a myriad of positions. To most beyonders and ordinary people, this might have been a normal response from suppressing his body when recently faced with temptation, but as a seer, a dream had a very special meaning. Klein quickly observed his body and realized he was still erect, semen flooding out from his penis and causing stains everywhere. This isn't a seer's dream revelation, but the result of an external influence. There's an enemy. Klein was alarmed as he quickly made up his mind. At the same time, he cautiously got out of bed and quickly changed into his admiral uniform. This way, he had the ninth law charm and creeping hunger on him, equipping him with potent self-preservation powers. As he wasn't clear of the present situation, Klein didn't attempt to head above the gray fog. He continued viewing himself as Amirius. With a staid expression, Klein carefully walked to the door and reached out his hand to grab the handle. At that instant, he seemed to finally find the connection with the real world as he heard the chaos and din outside the door. There were clear chewing sounds, debaucherous moaning, angry roaring, and sharp urging. What exactly happened? Everything was normal just moments ago. Klein gulped a mouthful of saliva as he used cogitation to maintain the necessary calm. He had been using spirit vision to observe the situation outside the villa every day and had not discovered any problems. Where are the Admiral's bodyguards? Where's Secretary Luan? Klein found the entire ordeal strange and terrifying the more he considered the situation before him. He touched the ninth law charm with one hand and made the deep domineering aura emanate, repressing the unease that was wafting through the air. Exerting strength in his left hand, Klein twisted the handle and opened the door. Before he took a step forward, he saw a red-vested attendant sitting opposite him. The attendant had many cooked and raw food placed in front of him. There was steak, mutton, dragon bone fish, and Oravi lobster. At this moment, the attendant picked up a huge fish that seemed to have just stopped struggling, raised his head, and smiled at Klein with a turbid look. Admiral, I have always envied your food. His stomach was different from before. It was bloated as though he was 7 or 8 months pregnant. Just as he said that, the attendant raised his arms and bit into the raw dragon bone fish, forcefully ripping out a piece of thick flesh. Fresh red blood dribbled from the corners of his mouth as his chewing sounds sent a chill down Klein's back. The attendant hurriedly gulped as he swallowed the food in his mouth. His bloated stomach trembled as though he would blow up at any moment. This is the instinctive reaction to restrict one's appetite. Klein observed the attendant carefully, and for some reason, he recalled the tramp stand-in who had died of a sudden illness due to gorging. He didn't spend too much time thinking or making attempts to rescue the attendant who was ravenously consuming the food. This was because he knew that nothing would be effective unless he resolved the matter at its roots. Klein moved his feet and followed his spiritual intuition's guidance, carefully walking towards the master bedroom. At the door, there were two maidservants. One of them was sitting on the other as she bent her back, strangling the other by the neck. Wearing a beaming smile, she shook the maidservant beneath her as she hurriedly urged her, quickly praise me. Quickly praise me. She desires acknowledgement. Klein frowned and took a few steps closer, grabbing onto the collar of the maidservant at the very top. He threw the maidservant to the other side of the wall, slamming her to the wall with a force strong enough to make anyone faint. However, this didn't prevent the maidservant from getting to her feet. The maidservant at the bottom kept yawning without opening her eyes. Even though her neck was being wrangled, she appeared as though she hadn't had enough sleep. Such a scene. Klein instantly had the urge to escape and seek help from the church or military. However, the strongest person on Oravi Island was none other than Admiral Amirius. And I'm Amirius at the moment. However, once the situation turns for the worse, I should flee when the time calls for it. I shouldn't act at the cost of my life. Klein pushed open the ajar master bedroom door, his scalp tingling with numbness. The first thing he heard behind the door was pleasurable moaning that gave itself up to one's primal instincts. Following that, a smell that made his heart race and sent blood gushing to his nether regions inundated his olfactory senses. In addition, there was an eclectic mix of all sorts of bodily fluids. A scene of indulging pleasure couldn't help but surface in Klein's mind right on the heels of that. Klein saw the blonde secretary, Luann. He stood by the door, looking inside with an overlooking and cold manner. His arrogance was extremely real. Upon sensing someone enter, he turned his head and discovered it was Admiral Amirius. His expression and gaze didn't change, as though he was looking at an ordinary, unimportant person. This secretary is usually very reverent, but he's actually such a prideful person? Klein originally wanted to question Luann, who seemed to possess some reason, but he saw him shift his gaze to look into the middle of the master bedroom from a height. He only looks normal. Klein traced Luann's gaze and discovered a fair body that was 3 meters tall in the middle of the master bedroom. It had brownish-green lumps growing on its surface that resembled treeworts. Some parts were cracked open, revealing organs that resembled flowers. It had the bodyguards and the male attendants gathered around it as they either stood or knelt, prostrating or floating as they mated with those organs, letting out deep grunting sounds. The other bodyguards and maid-servants of varying numbers were scattered across the carpet, enjoying each other's bodies to their heart's content. In addition, treeworts and flowers grew from the tall fair body, as well as brown branches that extended out as they participated in every promiscuous act of pleasure with the people present. What kind of monster is this? Klein had his knowledge of mysticism overturned once again. He lowered his left palm and prepared for battle. At this moment, the terrifying body which towered 3 meters tall turned a head over. It was a female. She had blonde hair and blue eyes. She had a high nose bridge and plump lips. She was none other than the beautiful Cynthia with hints of her youthfulness. As the tree branches danced while the flowers opened, Cynthia looked down at Klein with flushed cheeks as she said with hints of embarrassment, "Admiral, I want to have a child with you." Upon seeing Cynthia's huge fair body with treeworts and flowers growing on it as though she was a tree, as well as hearing her shy, reluctant request, Klein couldn't help but shudder as his hair stood on end. Such a scene exceeded a horror conceivable by human imagination. He had never encountered something like this even in his dreams. If he were himself back when facing Megos and Tingen, Klein definitely would have been affected by such a scene. He would have temporarily lost his ability to react due to the horror and panic, but after experiencing so much, he was an experienced Beyander in the true sense of the word. In the moment that Cynthia's words entered his ears, the glove on his left hand had already changed colors. It had turned black, emitting a noble and sinister feeling. This meant that Klein had activated creeping hunger and had switched to Wormtongue Mithor's soul, giving him the powers of a baron of corruption. At that instant, he distorted Cynthia's words, turning, "Admiral, I want to have a child with you," to, "Admiral, I only wish to have a child with you." This way, Klein believed that the bodyguards and male attendants around the tree-like monster would be pushed away, far away by Cynthia, after having her will distorted, giving them a chance for a breather. As for whether he would expose himself as a fake Admiral Emerius, he didn't care. At this moment, anyone who was still bothered about whether the true acting would be successful would definitely be someone with a serious case of obsessive-compulsive disorder, and he clearly wasn't. In addition, in an environment with all sorts of desires being magnified to the limit, Klein suspected that the others who had been influenced weren't paying attention to the battle or the actual situation. The Baron of Corruption's distortion power was activated silently, but Klein was appalled to discover that nothing changed with Cynthia or the men's actions. They weren't affected at all. I've already used distortion. The mutated Cynthia is able to directly resist such an influence. Klein's pupils constricted as he hurriedly jumped to the side. A brown tree branch sprouted out from where he was standing as a sticky flower bloomed at its tip. The flower was abnormally large. As it bloomed, it seemed like it was about to swallow a person whole. Although Klein had never seen cannibalistic flowers in the southern continent's rainforests, he didn't believe that they were any less terrifying or ridiculous as the one before him. Paw, paw, paw. Similar branches drilled out from the walls, floor, and ceiling as they chased after Klein with their moist flowers. During this process, the flowers bit down on Secretary Luan's head, as well as the bodyguards, male attendants, and maid-servants who were gyrating in pleasure on the surrounding carpet. At this moment, having learned the lesson that his distortion powers would be resisted, Klein didn't hesitate to pull out his right hand, a dark gold high-level charm clasped tightly in his palm. Ninth Law. He originally didn't plan on using the charm so quickly. It wasn't because he couldn't bear to use it, but he wished to engage in a longer battle to determine what Cynthia was good at after mutating into a monster. Only then could he target her weaknesses. After all, the Ninth Law was unable to make a general prohibition, and the clause had to be sufficiently specific. For example, it couldn't make Beyonder powers ineffective in the area, but it could specify the nullification of a specific Beyonder power. To use it to its fullest, he needed to observe carefully and make sound judgment. However, the present situation was forcing Klein to use his trump card. Otherwise, he suspected that he had no means of damaging this tree-like monster. If the Ninth Law charm isn't able to create an environment that allows me to kill the monster, I'll have to immediately escape from the villa with its help. I will lead Cynthia outside and find a chance to pray. I'll use the sea god scepter above the grey fog to bombard it with attacks. Just as the thought flashed in his mind, Klein, who had been constantly jumping amidst the attacking tree branches and flowers, solemnly chanted a word in ancient Hermes, law. As the activation incantation resounded, the dark gold charm in Klein's palm instantly turned ice cold. It was a coldness that seemed to make one lose any emotions. At that instant, Klein reached an extremely calm state. In the moment he threw out the Ninth Law charm, his thoughts rapidly surfaced as he considered what to prohibit. His first reaction was to prohibit the generation of any desire, but he knew that it was too general. Therefore, he thought of changing to the desire to procreate. After all, Cynthia's desire was to have a child with Admiral Emerius. The influence she had on her surroundings was a result of this. Just as the Ninth Law charm was flying in midair, turning into bits of dark gold beams of light that scattered into the surroundings, Klein suddenly thought of a problem. Cynthia was only an ordinary person prior to this. This is a certain fact. Over the past 3 nights, Klein had used spirit vision, divination, and other methods to repeatedly confirm that Cynthia wasn't a Beyonder. Similarly, she would have long been discovered by Admiral Emerius, who could distinguish between ordinary people and Beyonders. Therefore, her sudden transformation into a mutated monster was a problem he needed to pay close attention to. Could it be like Megos? She became a vessel of an evil god's descent through some form of ritual? No, if there's a ritual, it's impossible for me not to discover it. My spiritual intuition would have warned me not to activate my spirit vision and not look straight at Cynthia. It's some item or trait on her body that has an external force projected on her. Therefore, there weren't any problems the previous 2 nights until she suddenly mutated today. Regardless, the terror from her comes from somewhere else and not her body. Klein quickly made a judgment in 2 seconds. Without any hesitation, he seized the opportunity and said in a solemn tone, "This place is prohibited from having any interaction with the outside world." The ancient Hermes words, which were filled with mystery, instantly spread out as the dark golden light scattered everywhere and intertwined with the countless law-like symbols and magic labels before merging into the void. Hum. There was suddenly a light hum in Klein's ears as he seemed to see the formless light filled with desire get expelled out of the room. Immediately following that, an illusory and resplendent starry sky appeared before his eyes. They were points of bright stars. Pa! Pa! Klein's eyes burst as fluid, a mixture of blood and plasma, gushed out horrendously. Although he had used the ninth law charm to isolate any external influence, the level of the power was extremely high. Just a normal level of recoil was enough to penetrate the natural protection of the high-level charm and burst his eyes. This damage came abruptly and without any warning signs. Klein didn't even have the chance to use paper figurine substitutes, just like Nimblewright Master Rosago from back then. If not for the ninth law charm, his eyes might not have been the only things that burst. He might have turned into a monster just like Cynthia. Meanwhile, the tree-like Cynthia came to a stop as her body began crumbling, turning into flesh and blood with brownish-green warts. The surrounding bodyguards and male attendants plopped to the ground, unconscious. Cynthia's head was embedded in the blob of flesh as she muttered to herself, "Admiral, I want to have a child with you. Admiral, I want to have a child with you." She tried hard to extend the remaining tree branches on the ceiling and walls, binding Klein, who was still in a dazed state as a result of the recoil, and she pulled him towards herself. The moment Klein recovered a little, he immediately began struggling desperately. Despite his attempts to snap his fingers to light a fire or switch the powers of creeping hunger, he failed because his hands and arms were bound tightly. With the help of his clown powers, he saw the brownish-green warts approach. Stirred, Klein changed his appearance, turning his appearance from Admiral Emirius to Gehrman Sparrow, a Gehrman Sparrow with bleeding eyes. The binding tree branches paused as they mysteriously released their hold. They began flailing everywhere as though in an attempt to grab at something. Cynthia's head was filled with disappointment and confusion as she muttered, "Admiral, where did you go? Admiral, where did you go?" Without the external force to continue the resistance, she finally only had the thoughts of having a child with Emirius thanks to the Baron of Corruption's distortion. This made her release Gehrman Sparrow. Klein flipped to his feet and covered his eyes with his right hand and pulled downwards abruptly, moving the horrendous wound towards his left shoulder. As his left shoulder became mangled, creeping hunger was tainted with a pure and resplendent glow. Klein looked at Cynthia's head in the pile of flesh and blood with pity as he spread out his arms. A holy flame which swirled around a pillar of pure light descended from the sky, enveloping the monster that had been reduced to flesh and blood. Amidst the holy beam of light, having already lost its support from the external power, the tree warts and flesh rapidly disintegrated. It was like snow meeting a red-hot metal ball. Amidst an indescribable sizzling sound, Cynthia's face winced as abnormal agony showed itself on her face. She turned around with great difficulty, looking up and down, her expression turning horrified and confused. Finally, she realized that there was a problem with her. "Admiral," her voice trembled as she looked ahead with fear and despair, but all she could find was an unfamiliar face. Klein could have fed creeping hunger with Cynthia's remnant flesh and spirit body, but at that moment, he sighed and said with a calm voice, "Try not to make contact with strange artifacts or religions in the future." From his point of view, the reason why Cynthia had turned into this monstrosity either had to do with a cult or some particularly dangerous artifact. She had connected with some existence which couldn't be looked at directly, resulting in such a response. Cynthia seemed to understand something as her remnant head and tiny bit of flesh suddenly wept. "It's the Mother Tree of Desire, the Heavenly Body Sect. Admiral, Admiral, I don't want to die. I don't want to die. Save me, save me. Mother Tree of Desire. Heavenly Body Sect. This isn't within the confines of my knowledge of mysticism." Klein maintained his expression as he looked pitifully at the pleading Cynthia. He spread his arms again and said in a deep voice, "Death is not the end. You will be redeemed when you are at God's side." Another pure beam of light landed as Cynthia's beautiful, weeping face completely fixed in place. Her eyes widened in despair, but there was the remnant hope of being sent to heaven after death. Under the sun's radiance, her brain and remnant flesh melted away at a discernible pace. By vanishing, it had obtained its final rite of cleansing. Klein looked silently at this scene without any expression or movement. After everything calmed down, he curled the corner of his lips and chuckled, finding it hard to hide his sorrow. This is really a crazy and chaotic world. He didn't dare to channel Cynthia's spirit after what had happened. The many oddities had made him abandon the thought of bringing Cynthia's spirit body above the grey fog to inquire. Faced with the irremovable evil and the ever-worsening corruption, he could only choose to have Cynthia be cleansed. After all, in this world with true gods, there might exist a heaven after death. As for Creeping Hunger's backlash, Klein was temporarily not concerned. After spending a long time with it, this mystical item which had been sealed to a certain extent had adjusted to him. It didn't need to be fed after every use. It had been restored to its original state. Once it was activated, it just needed to eat once in a 24-hour period, regardless of how many times it was used. Of course, there was no need for it to be fed on the day it wasn't used. Therefore, Klein had plenty of time to seek out food for Creeping Hunger without harming the innocent. If the worst comes to the worst, I can throw it above the gray fog. Klein surveyed his surroundings, and he realized that the bodyguards and the male and female attendants in the room had shaken off the influence of their magnified desires, and they had fallen unconscious. This included the maidservant who was strangling her companion in a bid to obtain her approval and praise, as well as blonde secretary, Luann. Indeed, once the problem is resolved at its root, everything will come to an end. According to Admiral Amirius's description, Luann is at least a Sequence 6 Beyonder, and he's suspected to be a baron of corruption. He might have secretly reached Sequence 5. Even he was so easily controlled by his magnified desires, which means that the power that descended with the help of Cynthia is extremely potent. But why did I only have a wet dream? Ignoring my mystical items, Luann and I should be at the same level. Is it because a portion of the Grey Fog's power, when mixed with reality, provided me with help? Is it because of the restriction from Admiral Amirius's temporary contract? Or could it be a mix of both? Yes, if it wasn't because of these factors, as Cynthia's primary target, my desire towards sex would definitely be magnified. This wouldn't just be me having a romantic dream. Klein habitually reached out with his right hand to cover his face as he changed once again back into Amirius Revelt's appearance. As the lives of the others weren't temporarily under threat, he carefully observed the room when his spiritual perception was suddenly triggered. Taking a few steps forward, Klein came to where Cynthia had vanished. He bent down and picked up a necklace from a pile of torn clothes on the bed. A pendant that was the length of a finger segment hung from the necklace. It was completely black in color and looked like a miniaturized rhinoceros horn. Its surface was full and covered in cracks. Apart from exuding evil, there were no lustrous spirituality activity. This is the dangerous item that caused Cynthia to mutate? As it had connected to the existence which couldn't be looked at directly, it had completed its mission, allowing all its powers to be injected into Cynthia's body? Klein made a preliminary conjecture based on the pendant's situation and from his past experience. He checked the area and found nothing. Hence, he pulled out a paper figurine and dealt with the traces left behind. He dispelled the prohibition from the charm before walking towards Secretary Luann, who still had some signs of corruption due to temporarily being devoured by the flowers. He raised his knee and kicked him a few times with the tip of his shoe. With Amirius's character, it's unlikely that he would crouch down to shake his secretary awake. Hey, this fellow's arrogant way of looking down on others sure is irritating. I really want to beat him up. Klein paused as he watched sternly as Luann gradually woke up. Your Excellency, Luann was in a momentary daze, as though he couldn't tell dream from reality. As a high-ranking superior, I'm under no obligation to explain. Klein looked down at him and said in a deep voice, wake up all the lightly injured people. Get a number of them to treat the remaining people while the others are to investigate the heavenly body sect on Oravi Island. They worship an evil god named Mother Tree of Desire. Start the investigation with the people around Cynthia. I'll be waiting in the study for the report. With that said, he held the cracked rhinoceros horn pendant and turned to leave the master bedroom before entering the unaffected silent study. As an important member of the military, although he was somewhat helpless when faced with the kingdom's upper echelons, he needed to choose to ignore certain matters. An example was the telegram which relieved Aston from his post as Governor-General and the arrival of the new Governor-General. This meant that the new Governor-General had departed ahead of time, yet as the highest-ranking commander of the Central Sonia Seas Navy, Amirius Revelt had not received the news at all. However, on Oravi Island, to Secretary Luann and the local police system and naval base personnel, he still held absolute authority. He didn't need to do the investigations himself, as he had plenty of people at his disposal. A demigod only needed to be wary against any accidents and await news. There was no need to busy themselves. Inside the study, as Klein heard the chaotic sound of footsteps and horrified screams, questioning, and exchanges, he couldn't help but have the starry sky and the bright, lustrous star surface in his mind. What does it represent? Klein frowned and sat in the armchair behind the desk. His figure sank into the darkness brought about by the curtains. He soon made certain connections. Due to the legends from the City of Silver and Emlyn White's description of the Sanguine situation, he confirmed that the Moon pathway controlled a portion of the authority over reproduction and proliferation. This coincided with Cynthia's intentions and actions. A starry sky. Mr. Dorr informed Emperor Russell that the goddess's corresponding tarot card is the star and not the moon. Could it be that this illusory starry sky represents her? Yes, the primordial moon is suspected to be a particular deity, angel, or high-level devil's alternate identity. The goddess has the honorific name of Crimson Moon. Could she be the one passing herself off as the primordial moon and occupying the corresponding spot so as to control the required authority? Although Klein knew that such thoughts were sacrilegious, he couldn't help but suspect the Evernight goddess. But he soon rejected that conjecture. This was because, be it vampire ancestor Lilith or the primordial moon, what they projected was only reproduction and proliferation. It didn't include the recognition of gluttony, pride, and desire. This was at odds with a number of victims earlier. The other honorific titles of the Evernight goddess didn't include the corresponding domains. This does coincide with the traits of the devil pathway. A desire apostle is an expert in such matters. Could the one subjugating the primordial moon be a high-level devil, or even the king of devils who's known as the dark side of the universe, Sequence Zero Abyss? This is very possible, but the problem with this is that it shouldn't produce an illusory starry sky and bright stars. Be it moon or abyss, they have nothing to do with the corresponding symbols. Klein found his conjecture problematic the more he thought over the matter. Amidst his thoughts, he suddenly thought of a concept. It was something important back when he was first educated in mysticism but had never received a detailed description or explanation. That was the astral world. Apart from the Life School of Thought and a few other organizations' belief in uncommon concepts such as the world of absolute rationality, most schools of thought and mysticism believed that the world was comprised of the real world, the spirit world, and the astral world. There was no need to explain the real world. Knowledge of the spirit world was the foundation of many ritualistic magic and Beyonder powers. It was only the astral world where Klein's knowledge about it was basically zero. Therefore, the illusory starry sky represents the astral world. The bright star is a particular existence in the astral world? I've always suspected that the astral world is where the true gods reside. Then, this imagery which represents the primordial moon isn't something unacceptable. Klein didn't think further as he recalled the details of the past few days while awaiting the results of his subordinates' investigations. Time ticked by when Klein finally heard a familiar gate approach. Secretary Luan knocked before entering. He bowed his head and coldly reported, "Your Excellency. We've already found the Heavenly Body sect and captured their leader. It was a clue provided by Miss Cynthia's parents. This sect has been rather active in Oravi over the past few years. They do not wear clothes, in a bid to return to nature. Giving themselves up to their instincts is their purpose, and they believed that humans can attain liberation of their spirituality in such states. Reproduction of the next generation is a subsidiary product of this belief." After pausing for a moment, Luan added, "Their leader is a Beyonder, a Sequence 8 lunatic." Lunatic? A lunatic from the prisoner pathway? It has something to do with the Rose School of Thought? Yes, the Rose School of Thought internally has two factions, temperance, and indulgence. The latter's beliefs are rather identical to the present situation. Klein was alarmed as he said in a stoic tone, "Bring him here." The leader of the Naturism sect was named Flight Ken, a man in his 30s. His thin face had brown whiskers, and there were evil-looking tattoos on his neck. He was brought in front of Klein by Luan. He looked ragged, as though he had suffered the most severe mental torture. "Your Excellency, while he was being captured, he kept exchanging his intelligence for strength, and he's on the brink of a mental collapse." Luan reported the facts, ignoring the possibility that Admiral Amirius could tell the exact details. That's perfect. Klein had been previously worried that, as a lunatic, Flight Ken would refuse to answer his questions while under the mental pressure. That way, he had to take the risk of being suspected of dismissing his subordinates and attempting a spirit channeling. As he looked coldly at Flight Ken, Klein's left hand wore a golden luster under the cover of the desk. He had switched creeping hunger to the interrogator's soul. And interrogator happened to be Sequence 7 of Admiral Amirius's Arbiter pathway. Deep in Klein's eyes, two indistinct flashes of lightning appeared as they overlapped with Flight Ken's figure. Psychic piercing was poised for attack. However, Klein didn't directly use the Beyonder power, as it was only at the level of a Sequence 7. Once he used it in front of Luan, he would immediately expose himself to the blonde secretary. With the pressure provided by psychic piercing on Flight Ken's spirit body, Klein sat there like the real Admiral Emerius as he said in a deep voice, "Do you know Cynthia?" As he spoke, he raised his right hand high and dangled the black miniature rhinoceros horn from his palm. "What is its use?" The dispirited Flight Ken trembled as he felt as if a dagger was being held to his psyche, capable of penetrating him at any moment. He couldn't help but lower his head as he stammered, "Yes, I know her. Cynthia, Miss Cynthia wished to have a child with your excellency, a child with Beyonder powers. She was introduced to me by her parents. It's a proliferation necklace created with the bestowment of the goddess's aura. By consuming its powder and wearing it for prolonged periods of time, it will be able to make your excellency unable to resist her." Klein listened in silence as he was half convinced by Flight Ken's explanation. However, he still had his doubts. He believed that it was partially Cynthia's goal. This beautiful lady did wish to have a child with Admiral Emerius, either by her own will or from the urging of others. This could be seen from her persistence even after she mutated. Although the Loan Kingdom's aristocrats didn't like or even discriminated against their illegitimate children, it was situational. A child who had successfully inherited their father's Beyonder characteristics would similarly be given importance. Those ancient families who knew many secrets viewed this with importance, and the Revelt family was one of those families. Furthermore, Admiral Emerius is a stern and old-fashioned man on the surface, but he's someone who treasures his relationships. Even an illegitimate child would receive his love and have importance attached. This might be the real reason why Cynthia was eager to have his child. Klein sighed inwardly. The doubt towards Flight Ken's answer was concentrated on the true effects of the proliferation necklace, as well as the possibility of the Naturism sect deliberate misleading of Cynthia. As he strengthened the pressure brought about by psychic piercing, Klein silently stared into Flight Ken's eyes until he could no longer take it and bowed his head again. "What other uses does this necklace have?" Klein shook the cracked pendant. His tone was calm, as though he knew every secret. His questions were only to obtain the final confirmation. An indescribable pressure inundated Flight Ken, who was already on the brink of a mental collapse. He plopped to the ground and shouted nearly hysterically, "It can corrupt you." As long as Cynthia consumed the powder ground from it and sincerely chanted Mother Tree of Desire's honorific name, any man who has sex with her and successfully has a child would be corrupted. That will make you become a believer of the Mother Tree of Desire. To become, her, blessed. So that's how it is. Klein instantly understood the entire story, and he was no longer puzzled by the mutation that happened that very night. The Naturism sect's goal is to use Cynthia and the proliferation necklace, which looks like an ordinary object, to corrupt Admiral Emerius, making this important military figure of the Loan Kingdom become the Mother Tree of Desire's devout believer. He can then help their sect develop and provide them protection. The key to the success of this method is that it's sufficiently concealed and normal. It is in no way directly connected to terms like potency, strike, and terrifying. Therefore, after 3 rejections from me, Cynthia was unable to expel the corruptive forces in the proliferation necklace's powder from her body. She gradually reached her limit and finally connected with the Mother Tree of Desire and ended up with what seemed like a sudden mutation. Therefore, the monster after the mutation wasn't able to pose any threat to the real Admiral Emerius. Even my usage of the 9th law charm easily resolved the matter. This is because this wasn't the outcome the Naturism sect wished to have. They wished to have Admiral Emerius be secretly corrupted, and not have a conflict with a demigod. Klein silently looked at the secretary Luan. Luan had also gained a rough understanding of the entire situation. He immediately lowered his head and said in a deep voice, "Your Excellency, it was our oversight. We only monitored Miss Cynthia and the servants here without expanding the monitoring to their friends and family. I'm willing to accept any punishment for this, even if you send me to be court-martialed." How would the real admiral reply? Klein once again immersed himself in the character of Emerius, experiencing his recent pain, helplessness, grief, and anger. He maintained his seating posture and sternly said, "We shall leave this for later." The hidden meaning behind this sentence meant, "I'll decide based on your upcoming performance." Luan was taken aback for a second, seemingly finding the admiral's mild punishment unbelievable. Klein half closed his eyes and said in a deep voice, "My father, the deceased Earl Revelt, once taught me this. He said to pardon the first mistake of a subordinate. Luan, you, as well as the other bodyguards, should be thankful for his benevolence." Luan's gaze shimmered as he drew a silent breath. He was no longer as calm, as he rather earnestly said, "Your benevolence is admirable. I pledge my utmost loyalty to you, apart from my principles, God, and kingdom. The pride in you is extremely exaggerated." Klein didn't believe him as he said seemingly calm, "There's a second half of the saying, that is, punish them for their second mistake." Luan nodded, unsurprised at that. Klein cast his gaze back to Flight Ken who was slumped on the ground. He pressed without a change in expression, "Who instigated you to do this?" From his point of view, Flight Ken's answer was likely that they had planned it. After coming into contact with Cynthia and learning of her requests and knowing who her lover was, the Naturism sect boldly had the idea of corrupting the naval admiral, Amirius. Flight looked left and right somewhat neurotically as he apprehensively said, It was the mother tree of desire. She instigated me to do it in my dream. In the beginning, I only wanted to lend Cynthia the proliferation necklace and for her to wear it. I never planned on her consumption of the powder. Instigated by the mother tree of desire? This is almost equivalent to a revelation. Klein nearly frowned. Although Admiral Amirius is an important figure of the Loan military and the highest-ranking commander of the Central Sonia Sea, making his standing and power rather tremendous, it shouldn't be important enough to have an evil goddess set her sights on him. However, I'm not an evil god. I have no way of comprehending their thought process. Perhaps the corruption of Amirius is for subsequent plans. Yes, I can't eliminate the possibility that Flight Ken is lying. I'll have to confirm it later. Klein thought before sternly asking, when did you have this dream? Flight forced a smile filled with fear and said, It was nighttime on the 4th of February, last Friday. I remember it very clearly. I had just released The Spirituality of a Lady. The 4th of February. Klein ruminated over the date, momentarily unable to find anything special about it. After 2 seconds of silence, he turned to ask, what relationship do you have with the Rose School of Thought? What relationship does the Mother Tree of Desire have with the Chained God? He wasn't worried that Admiral Amirius might have already known of this, with Secretary Luan having a certain understanding of the matter. This could be easily understood as a confirmation question. Flight Ken revealed a passionate look he could hardly keep in. We're a branch of the Rose School of Thought. My mentor is the Rose School of Thought's saint, Zatwin. The Chained God is another manifestation of the Mother Tree of Desire. The Mother Tree of Desire is the true and only deity that surpasses the 7 gods and the true creator. Your Excellency, you are a candidate to be, her, blessed. Who can't brag? Can it be understood that the Mother Tree of Desire is an alt of the Chained God? According to the evil spirit in the underground ruins suspected to be Red Angel Medici, the prisoner path of the divine and the devil pathway can be swapped. Therefore, it's no surprise that the Rose School of Thought's Chained God can magnify the various desires of creatures. They have the temperance and indulgence factions internally. This matches the situation, Klein thought as he turned his head to Luan and said, go out for a while. He planned on questioning Flight Ken on whether he had done anything evil, and if he was suitable to be Creeping Hunger's meal. Yes, Your Excellency. Luan didn't ask why as he briskly walked out the study and closed the door behind him. After the echoing sound of the door closing subsided, the entire study suddenly turned quiet. It was as though it was isolated from the outside world. The Beyonder powers of a baron of corruption? The distortion of door closing to seal the study? Very considerate. Klein pondered for a few seconds as he recalled the series of thoughts he had previously. Hence, he suddenly asked, the 6th of February. What did you do on Sunday evening? Flight Ken was taken aback as he said, we followed the revelation given by Mother Tree of Desire, and using the proliferation necklace and a hair obtained from a particular tramp, we held a ritual to magnify the tramp's gluttony. The tramp stand-in meant for Admiral Amirius was indeed killed by you. It was to prevent the Admiral from leaving and, hence, fall into a trap so that he can have sex with Cynthia and end up being corrupted? Klein instantly connected all the matters together. And my appearance provided another possibility that coincidentally destroyed this plan. Coincidence? That's not right. When the words coincidence flashed in his mind, Klein suddenly recalled the peculiarity of the 4th of February, the day that Mother Tree of Desire gave Flight Ken a dream revelation. It was the first day he arrived on Oravi Island. Don't tell me that this matter was targeted at me? Klein was alarmed as he immediately became abnormally awake. As a person who had several similar experiences, he had quite a persecution complex. It really is possible. The Mother Tree of Desire used a dream to send Flight Ken a revelation just as I arrived at Oravi Island and began an entire series of plans. The first day I met Bilt Brando was the day the Naturism sect held the ritual to make the tramp stand and die from gluttony. If they were targeting Admiral Emirius, the plan needed to ensure that there was no lack of a stand-in, and that he couldn't find an additional helper or other means to conceal his departure. But clearly, this is something that cannot be confirmed. My involvement is proof. If the target was me, then the previous problem is explained. Klein used his clown powers to control his facial expression as he gloomily looked at Flight Ken. With such a theory, more questions emerged in his mind. But how were they certain that Bilt Brando would seek me out? The news of Gehrman Sparrow being able to change into anyone was spread from Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. It's an element beyond the Mother Tree of Desire's control. Of course, taking a different point of view, it's precisely due to the spreading of this news and my arrival in Oravi Island that made the Mother Tree of Desire send the revelation and put the plan into motion. But why would she want to corrupt me? My grudge with the Rose School of Thought hasn't reached the point of garnering the attention of an evil god. All I did was kill a Sequence 5 Wraith, a Sequence 6 Zombie, and a Sequence 7 Werewolf, with Miss Sharon and Marich, snatching away the Scarlet Lunar Corona and biological poison bottle. My hunt against Admiral of Blood was terminated before it even started. It was an idea that didn't translate into action. The only thing that happened was the killing of Steel Mavethi. The act of revenge that resulted from this matter shouldn't even exceed the attention of a saint. Was it something special about me that resonated with some item formed by the aura of the Mother Tree of Desire on this island the moment I stepped onto it? But I've never faced any abnormal reactions from the holy artifacts left behind by other deities in Backland or Tingen City. Furthermore, I did divine the matter above the grey fog and received the revelation that the death of the tramp was solely a coincidence. It wasn't arranged by a legendary creature or Grade 0 sealed artifact, but the outcome ended up different. This is the first time that divination above the grey fog has been disrupted in the true sense of the word? I didn't even notice that it had been disrupted? Klein's thoughts came to a pause as he discovered the most serious problem. Back when the matter involved 008, all he received was an ineffective revelation and not a disrupted outcome. Therefore, it's a power that exceeds a Grade 0 sealed artifact? The Mother Tree of Desire personally disrupted the matter, and she is a true deity herself. But it's very difficult for the seven gods to influence the real world. There has to be a corresponding ritual. Yes, I had also divined the risks of acting as Emirius above the grey fog and received a revelation saying that it was an acceptable risk. The outcome does match the development of the situation, so it wasn't disrupted? The more Klein thought about the matter, the more perplexed he became. What was most incomprehensible about it was that if the target of corruption was himself, why didn't he suffer any demanding trials, and he instead solved the problem in a relatively simple manner? This made the Mother Tree of Desire's arrangement appear like a joke. While pondering with this weight in mind, Klein nearly crushed Flightken. He asked again to verify his conjecture. To his surprise, the Naturism sect hadn't held any rituals to request the Mother Tree of Desire to disrupt any divination over the past week. They didn't make any special arrangements aimed towards the failure of the project. Strange. Klein took out a gold coin and flicked it as a final confirmation. Even without divination, he was almost certain that Flightken wasn't lying. Firstly, the man was already on the brink of a mental collapse, making him lack the ability to fabricate something reasonable. Secondly, Flightken's answers adhered to logic, completely confirming whatever Klein had deliberately kept to himself. The gold coin landed in his open palm, the king's portrait facing up, indicating a positive response. Combined with the divination statement, Klein finally confirmed that Flightken wasn't lying. After temporarily suppressing his puzzlement, he cast his gaze towards Flightken once again. He asked without a smile, "What deeds have you done in the past that violate the kingdom's laws or the moral fabric of society?" Flightken was taken aback for a few seconds as his mental state seemed to instantly turn for the better. From his point of view, his ploy against Admiral Emirius was the most serious crime, something that would most easily enrage this important figure. Everything else was trivial and nothing that needed a demigod to waste his time and energy on. Therefore, after skipping the important matters and coming to an ordinary topic, it meant that he might enjoy a good outcome. Flightken couldn't help but reveal a discreet smile as he hastened to recount. "I once tortured a family for an entire night for their property and abandoned them in the woods after murdering them. Then, I used fake documents and successfully obtained a sizable amount of wealth. I deliberately enticed many believers to indulge in their desires and watched as their emptiness and regret after the deed slowly paved the way for them to become fertilizer for the mother tree of desire. I once tricked many ladies to abide with their nature, an excuse for them to be redeemed by the spirits, allowing me to possess them. I tortured believers who attempted to renounce the religion, slicing off every part that protruded off their bodies. He recounted each and every sin of his, without any thoughts of concealing the truth. Klein felt disbelief with what he heard. He never expected anyone to be evil to this extent. As Flight Ken got increasingly excited from recounting his past deeds, he saw Admiral Emirius stand up without an expression before circling around the desk and standing in front of him. The Admiral then raised his left palm. A terrifying mouth appeared in the middle of the left palm, revealing 2 rows of illusory, white, and eerie teeth that were icy cold. No, no! A sharp and horrified scream resounded in the room for a long time until silence prevailed. After a while, Klein bent down to pick up a blob of grayish-white light that resembled a shrunken brain. This was the Beyonder characteristic of a lunatic. Unfortunately, Flight Ken had been searched before being brought here. He didn't leave behind any cash or items. Klein snapped his fingers and ignited the rest of the clothes. As he looked at his left shoulder which was beginning its recovery process, he sat behind the desk and remained silent amidst the dancing scarlet flames. Once the traces were no longer noticeable, he pulled at a corresponding rope, making the bell outside ring. Luann released the restriction and entered, instinctively observing every corner. Instruct the guards and the base personnel to cooperate with the Oravi police to do a cleanup of the Naturism sect. It's best if clues can be found and a number of Rose School of Thought members are caught. Klein solemnly gave the order. Yes, Your Excellency, Luann answered respectfully. He didn't ask where Flight Ken was, as though the leader of the Naturism sect never existed. Klein didn't pay too much attention to the raid on Oravi Island. Using the excuse that he was slightly injured, he declined the remaining schedules for the next 2 days. This meant that he didn't need to worry about needing to exude the might of a high-sequence Beyonder of the Arbiter pathway after expending the 9th Law Charm. Nearing noon, Luann entered after knocking the door and reported, Your Excellency, Mr. Aston has yet to leave on the liner. The new Governor-General, Ben Conrad, has sent an invitation to participate in the banquet he's hosting tonight. Ben Conrad, the person who replaced Aston as Governor-General. According to what I know, Viscount Conrad's family is a loyal subject of the royal family. Talum likely got to know Prince Adesic while being the equestrian teacher of Viscount Conrad's youngest son. Klein nodded gently as he immersed himself in Emirius Revelt's complex emotions. He remained silent for a few seconds before saying, Inform Governor-General Conrad that it's inconvenient for me to attend the banquet, because of the injuries suffered from the Naturism sect's assault. Apologize to him on my behalf. Yes, Your Excellency. Luann didn't persuade him otherwise and calmly left the room. A demigod definitely had the right to be willful. As long as he didn't engage in some secret ploy or commit any serious mistake, there was no way he would be blamed regardless of what he did. This was because any faction would be willing to rope in a demigod. As he watched Luann's back vanish from the door, Klein shook his head indiscernibly and sat back behind the desk. A quiet day quickly passed. When it was almost midnight, Klein, who was sleeping in the guest room, suddenly woke up and sat up. His spiritual perception told him that someone had entered the house. Klein focused his gaze at the window and saw a middle-aged man in a tailcoat. He had black hair and blue eyes, with the corners of his mouth slightly sagging. He was none other than Admiral Emirius. Phew, he's finally back. Klein slowly stood up and cautiously asked, What item did you give me before? He was afraid that the Admiral Emirius before him was also a faceless in disguise. Admiral Emirius stood there and answered with a stern expression, the 9th Law Charm. Without waiting for Gehrman Sparrow to speak again, he took 2 steps forward and calmly asked, Did anything happen in the past few days? Klein controlled his facial muscles and said, Your secretary committed a mistake and was injured. Oh? What else? Admiral Emirius nodded with deep reservation. Klein tried hard not to move his gaze away as he looked straight at him and said, Your younger brother has been relieved of his post as Governor-General. The new Governor-General has already taken over. Your Miss Cynthia mutated into a monster and was purified by me. A number of your bodyguards and attendants were infected to a certain extent and are currently receiving treatment. Emirius's expression turned into shock bit by bit in an uncontrollable manner. His eyes moved slightly, as though he suspected whether he had returned to the wrong place. It had only been 3 days. After a frozen moment of silence, Amirius quickly brought his expressions under control. He said in a domineering and deep tone, "Tell me the specifics." Klein didn't hide much of the truth. He began with Aston Revelt's question, before mentioning the warning from the mysterious person in the dream, and how he was told not to make a choice that resisted the trend of the times. Following that, he talked about the sudden telegram, and finally he spoke of Cynthia's mutation. He went into detail about the situation, the arrogance of the secretary, how he dealt with it, and the general investigations that followed. The only information he kept to himself was that the 4th of February was the first day he arrived on Oravi Island, as well as his subsequent guesses. Of course, he was also very vague with matters regarding combat. He believed that Admiral Amirius was understanding enough. After all, what a Beyonder was good at or what unique abilities he had were one of their greatest secrets. If they were exposed or understood by others, it gave others a chance of setting up a targeted ambush, making it possible for them to die under the hands of an enemy of a lower sequence. Below that of high-sequence Beyonders, many Beyonders could be very powerful or very weak. After Amirius listened to the recount in silence, his expression didn't seem to change in the darkroom. However, the fact that he hadn't interrupted Klein's recount implied something. After a few seconds of silence, he asked in a deep voice, "The mysterious person who infiltrated your dream emphasized the fate of an era, as well as the trend of the times?" Yes. Klein had already changed back into Gehrman Sparrow's appearance. He didn't deliberately go into detail that the mysterious person had never mentioned Aston Revelt's exact plan. Amirius fell silent again. "You maintain my appearance in your dream?" "Yes, this is my secret," Klein answered succinctly. Amirius nodded indiscernibly as he paced around in a tiny area before looking back at Gehrman Sparrow. "There were no problems with your choices." Upon hearing this, Klein seemed to receive the ultimate and most effective feedback. A large portion of the potion in him was digested as a result. Amidst the deep, reverberating tone, Amirius turned his body to the side and said without any hint of emotion, "I originally had no plans to have a contract with the stand-in, and instead I wanted to inform Cynthia that I had the symptoms of losing control, making it impossible for me to have any physical relationship with her for 5 days. However, I later changed my mind due to certain reasons. If not for the temporary contract's forceful restriction, even if I'm able to withstand the temptations during usual times, I might not have been able to resist the magnified desires last night. Of course, if Cynthia knew of the 5-day restriction ahead of time, she wouldn't be in such a rush to consume the powder ground from the proliferation necklace. It would have prevented her from sensing the mother tree of desire and end up mutating. But as such, the ball is in the naturism sex court. They could have made up an excuse to get Cynthia to consume it. This matter was really targeted at me. What does the mother tree of desire actually want? Also, what was the reason that caused Admiral Amirius to make such an important change?" Klein seemed to grasp the crux of the matter as he looked at Amirius's side profile. "What's the reason?" Amirius said with a deadpan expression, "There's no need for you to know." For the first time in his life, Klein hated such a response. After some thought, he took out the cracked pendant and threw it at Amirius. "This is the proliferation necklace that originated from the mother tree of desire." Amirius raised his hand to catch it before looking down. "You may leave. Go to Bilt to receive your reward. Aren't you worried that I know of something I'm not supposed to know?" "That's right. Ashton's ploy has been exposed and is known by his political enemies." As for Amirius, he was clearly not involved. Therefore, it doesn't matter if I understand anything. Klein imagined that there would be a long-term confidential contract, but to his surprise, he could leave just like that. Noticing that Amirius didn't raise another matter, he pointed at him and said, "Close." Only then did Admiral Amirius look up, silently taking off the formal attire comprised of a shirt and tailcoat. Klein had originally wished to ask for additional payment due to the excessive dangers that went beyond the scope of the original agreement. But after secretly confirming that Cynthia's outcome was because of him, he abandoned the idea while feeling guilty. He quickly took off the comfortable sleeping robe, switched into a tailcoat, and under Amirius's guidance, leapt out of the window, and secretly left the gardened villa while the bodyguard's eyes were confounded. Amirius donned a sleeping robe and clenched the proliferation necklace before walking to the window. He stood there silently as he faced the crimson moon and few stars in the dark night. He stood there without an expression, not even changing his posture for a long period of time. "Paw!" He slightly relaxed his clenched fist as the miniaturized rhinoceros horn fell to the ground in the form of shattered pieces, bit by bit, fragment by fragment. Ellipsis. The next day at noon, Klein, who had slept soundly the entire night, left the inn and took a carriage to Sweet Lemon Bar. He went to the second floor to meet Bilt Brando. It's over? Bilt asked with relief and surprise. Klein nodded and said, Admiral Amirius has returned. Where's the rest of the payment? Bilt revealed an unconcealable smile. After he dismissed his guards, he personally went to a safe and took out the remaining £500 and a blue cufflink. This is the mystical item created from the Murloc bladder you provided, Bilt introduced. It can provide illusory scales hidden beneath the skin, so you will be as difficult to catch as a fish. It will also help withstand a certain level of damage for you. With it, you can dive to at least 15 meters without any protective gear. You can freely move about in the water for 10 minutes. It doesn't have any serious negative effects. It will just make you tired easily when in a hot or arid place. That means this cufflink shouldn't be used with the sunbrooch. Klein extended his hand to collect the money and item. Aren't you afraid that there will be problems? Bilt cracked a joke. Your business is here, Klein answered calmly. His meaning was clear. If there were any problems, he wasn't afraid that the person in charge would go missing. Bilt's smile froze as he said, It hasn't been named. You can give it one. Murloc cufflink. Klein couldn't be bothered to waste his brain cells. Nice name. It leaves quite an impression, Bilt said with a forced smile. He paused for a moment before saying, that artisan said that he can fix the summoning ritual of a spirit world creature onto materials with spirituality. It will be able to last a maximum of 1.5 years, but you will need to provide detailed information. Heh, according to our agreement, I'll be responsible for it, so there's nothing to be worried about. Alright, make it a harmonica. Klein took out a pen and paper from his pocket and scribbled the ritual to summon his messenger. Messenger? This is rather rare. It's very hard for Beyonders not from the death pathway to find a suitable one. Bilt received the piece of paper and casually scanned it. If the messenger is accidentally summoned during the production process, a gold coin has to be given to her. What happens if it's not given? Heh. Spirit world creatures always have something odd about them. I've seen some who love music, as well as ones who loiter around shit. What happens if you don't give one? Perhaps Mam Rynette Tinnicker might bring the heads of you and the artisan to me. She's a creature with a castle in the spirit world. She might even be stronger than me. Well, under situations when I'm not using the sea god scepter. Klein lampooned as he said in a deep voice, the third promised item can be left to the future. Alright, Bilt didn't have any objections. Following that, he asked out of curiosity, Mr. Gehrman, how did you fool Secretary Luan, Governor General Aston, and Miss Cynthia? People who Admiral Amirius specifically mentioned? Klein did his best to prevent his facial muscles from twitching. Follow the information and think about it carefully. He didn't provide an exact description before he stood up and bowed with his hat. It's time I bid farewell. It was a pleasure working with you, Bilt answered with a smile. After watching Gehrman Sparrow's figure vanish behind the door, he shook his head and chuckled, muttering, this powerful and crazy adventurer is actually a natural actor? After lunch, his subordinate sent him the day's papers. As Bilt sucked on a cigar, he flipped through it when his expression suddenly froze. Last night, the new Governor-General, Ben Conrad, held a banquet. New Governor-General? Aston Reveldt has been relieved of his position as Governor-General? Bilt picked up the other sets of newspapers and found the same piece of information. With his connections in Oravi, he should have long heard of news regarding a replacement of the Governor-General. However, the replacement was extremely sudden. Most people only learned of the situation when the new Governor-General officially made his appearance. After a while, a partner who was secretly serving Admiral Amirius entered the room. Your Excellency wants you to investigate the people around you for Naturism sect believers and sink them all into the sea. The partner passed on Amirius's instructions. All right, Bilt asked curiously, what exactly happened? The Naturism sect suffered a terrible blow since yesterday. His Excellency suffered an assassination attempt from the Naturism sect yesterday. Miss Cynthia perished as a result. Secretary Luan was injured, and the Admiral lost many of his bodyguards, the partner described simply. Ah? Bilt was momentarily stunned. Aren't these the people Admiral Amirius mentioned to be careful of when acting in front of them? I even specially emphasized it to Gehrman Sparrow. Now, Miss Cynthia is dead, Secretary Luan is injured, and Aston Reveldt has been relieved of his position as Governor-General. The corners of Bilt's mouth twitched while he wore a blank expression. East Chester County, Stowen City. Audrey silently listened to a noble lady's words, echoing her from time to time as she provided an ear to listen to. Towards the end, the noble lady praised her sincerely. "Audrey, you really are an angel. I feel a lot more comfortable after chatting with you." At this moment, Audrey saw the female priest from the Church of Evernight enter. Hence, she exchanged pleasantries before walking over with a smile. This priest appeared ordinary, as she only provided low-level preachings, but in fact, she was a secret member of the Psychology Alchemists. "Audrey, the potion formula is already in my hands. However, you need to contribute enough to obtain it," the female priest whispered while no one was paying attention. Audrey's eyes darted around slightly as she said, "That wouldn't be an issue. However, Ma'am Smine, can you tell me its name?" The female priest looked around before saying with a suppressed voice, "Hypnotist." After leaving the Sweet Lemon Bar, Klein directly returned to his inn. Just as he was packing his luggage, the gigantic skeleton messenger appeared suddenly. It originally wanted to pat Klein on the shoulder, but it failed due to its nearly 4-meter-tall body with its head penetrating through the ceiling. All it could do was throw the letter ahead before collapsing into nothingness. "Mr. Azek has finally replied. It has almost been a week. Has the messenger been changed? It looks like the original one and would make the corresponding warning." Klein caught the letter and unfolded it. "I'm very sorry that I'm only replying to you today. Perhaps it's because the memories I've recovered has exceeded the limits of my body. I had to spend several days in a deep sleep to adapt to it. The matters you described does coincide with the traits of a marauder pathway. Their corresponding sequence 4 is parasite. In higher sequences, they possess the Beyonder powers of parasitized bodies. According to what I know, there are 2 types of parasitizing. The first type is a preliminary state. The parasite would borrow the host's body to hide himself, so as to extend his lifespan and recover from his injuries. He can see and hear whatever the host sees and hears, but he is unable to interfere with the host's thoughts or steal his thoughts. Therefore, for a host to converse with a parasite, he will have to be the first to speak. The other is full control. The parasite is nearly fused with the host's spirit body, knowing and understanding his thoughts, as well as take over control of the body. Faced against the first type of parasite, one can inform the host via dreams or a subconscious conversation without worrying about being discovered by the parasite. This is because the parasite has to use the host's senses to sense his surroundings. For the second state, there is no way to converse with the host without the parasite's knowledge. However, there is a chance of eradicating the parasite, which is to rely on the host's faith. It's very difficult for me to accurately describe such matters, and all I can say is that when one opens his heart while praying, the target of the prayer would be able to discover the existence of the parasite, and through a particular ritual, provide feedback to complete the separation or eradication. Of course, the prerequisite is that the host himself doesn't know of this. Otherwise, the parasite would definitely be alerted and begin carrying out preventive measures. Isn't the latter situation somewhat similar to Little Sun's? He prayed to me without much thought, and I discovered the existence of Amon's avatar. Then, with a concealed goal, I taught him the secret deed ritual and used it to cleanse the parasite. Klein instantly had a deeper understanding of the previous situation he was in. However, I'm currently unable to determine which state my dear poet is in. Back in Tingen, he would occasionally talk to himself. This might be a result of the first type of parasitic states, but the problem lies in the fact that it has been months. It's possible that the parasite has completed his complete control of Leonard. I have to first confirm the matter before knowing what I should do. Otherwise, rashly entering his dream will only lead to preemptively warning the parasite, making the problem more serious and harder to resolve. If it's the second parasitic state, my dear poet believes the goddess, but she has millions of believers. It's unlikely that she would pay important notice to a red glove who's neither a blessed or saint. She's unlike me, the fool. I read every prayer and often provide a one-to-one service. This is what it's like during a startup phase. As Klein thought over it, he suddenly sighed and felt wistful. He originally planned on entrusting a task to Emlyn to secretly monitor Leonard Mitchell to see if he often whispered to himself. However, after considering how Emlyn had already appeared before Leonard and the parasite because of Tinder, there was a high chance that he was a target they were wary of or a target of investigation. Therefore, he rationally abandoned such a thought. Miss Magician is only a sequence 8 and a trickmaster. She doesn't have the ability to monitor a parasite at the angel level or a red glove. Miss Justice's identity is the best form of concealment. Besides, she's also a believer of the goddess. But the problem lies in the fact that she's back in her fief. She will only return to Backland in June. Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit are at sea. As for Little Sun, there's no way for him to connect with the outside world. There's still not enough Tarot Club members. The factions they've expanded into are still lacking. I can't find any suitable person to help me complete this task. Among the people I know, Miss Sharon should be the best choice to perform such matters when it comes to concealment, but I have no way of contacting her, even if I do it through Miss Magician or Emlyn. Sigh, I had fled Backland in a hurry, so I failed to consider many of the consequences. Klein raised his hand to knead his temples as he thought about how Leonard was an elite Red Glove in the Nighthawks. There were high-ranking deacons and the church watching over him, so it was unlikely the parasite would dare to do anything for now. Hence, he decided to put the matter aside and wait for a more suitable helper. Perhaps I can wait until I digest the potion and head east of the Sonia Sea to find mermaids. After I complete my advancement, I can return to Backland and do it myself. The experienced Klein didn't hesitate further as he rapidly made up his mind. Inside Sweet Lemon Bar, after the uneasy Bilt handled 2 Naturism sect believers among his close aides, he finally received some good news. Are you telling me that Admiral Emirius will be returning to Bayham today? He stood up with a cigar in hand. Sothoth nodded gently and said, his fleet left the harbor half an hour ago. It's steering towards the Rorstad archipelago. Phew, Bilt didn't conceal his sigh of relief, having confirmed that the Admiral wasn't putting any blame on him. Just the thought of how Gehrman Sparrow had managed to make the Admiral suffer the loss of so many of his bodyguards, the younger brother's loss of his position as Governor-General, the injury of his secretary, and the death of his mistress, he couldn't help but wonder about his own management capabilities. Although the responsibility of these matters wasn't necessarily Gehrman Sparrow's fault, to have them all happen at once had made one believe that it was the crazy adventurer's fault. At the very least, he was unlucky enough. And as his employer and endorser, Bilt believed that there was no way he could escape responsibility. He definitely needed to incur punishment from Admiral Emirius. His Excellency is indeed a demigod. He didn't let his rage blind his reason. Praise the Lord. May the storm be with us, Bilt said as he struck his right fist on his left breast. At this moment, the subordinates he sent rushed back. Boss, Gehrman Sparrow has disappeared, the subordinate reported in a hurried tone. Bilt frowned slightly. Disappeared? Yes. After he checked out of his room, he held his suitcase and circled the area several times before disappearing. The subordinate explained truthfully. It's really difficult to monitor an adventurer who can shapeshift into anyone. Bilt sighed and said, leave it. There's no need to seek him out again. Ellipsis. After being targeted by the Mother Tree of Desire, Klein cautiously changed his appearance and identity, as well as his place of residence to prevent anyone from targeting him. From the feedback received from acting as Admiral Emirius, he decided to quickly digest the potion by putting it into practice. While riding a carriage to the Oravi Hospice Foundation, Klein once again stepped in. The person in charge of the registration was still Ma'am Joanna. She looked up and asked, "Do you want to do volunteer work?" Yes. Klein nodded seriously. Joanna took out a form and asked like clockwork, "Name?" Klein smiled and replied, "Sinbad Valentier." The weather in Eastchester County during April was comfortable. The vegetation was lush and the scenery was beautiful. It was the perfect season for hunting. Audrey was dressed in a waist-fitting black riding suit with a helmet. She was on a burgundy mare, that belonged to her, while in pursuit of a brightly colored wild chicken. She shot a whistling arrow and accurately struck the prey. As a psychiatrist, her physical attributes had clearly been enhanced. Together with her education in archery from a young age, whether it was in shooting firearms or in archery, she was considered rather skilled. A golden figure pounced forward and rapidly bit onto the prey which had lost its life. It was none other than Susie. "It's a pleasure working with you." The corners of Audrey's lips curled up as she struck her palm with Susie's paw with a smile. At this moment, the aristocrats surrounding her came over, either praising her for her hunting prowess or her training of her hunting hound. Audrey felt a little ashamed regarding the latter half. She had never trained Susie before. The aristocrats quickly dispersed as they continued chasing their prey. As for the low-level priest of the Evernight goddess, she came over and said to Audrey with a suppressed voice, "You can receive the hypnotist formula after completing the final mission." Finally, Audrey's eyes lit up as she silently nodded. To be frank, if she were still the green and squeamish noble lady of the past, she would have long lost the patience to accumulate the required contributions and would have ended up requesting the purchase of the hypnotist potion formula at the Tarot Club. but she knew very well that building up contributions would aid her infiltration into the psychology alchemists. She would be more trusted and build up a good foundation for her to receive the high-sequence potion formulas in the future. Therefore, she patiently performed matters that were either uninteresting or interesting. Of course, Audrey didn't waste the past 2 months. She had been eavesdropping on the conversations of the aristocrats and maidservants, before guiding them to pour out their frustrations and aid them in defeating their negative emotions. This allowed her to act as a psychiatrist very perfectly. During this process, she realized that she would unknowingly eavesdrop, observe, and steer the people around her, to understand their flaws and habitual thought processes. She believed that she could disadvantage or mentally break any one of them without leaving a mark. She could also get them to help her by their own will without them even realizing it. It has to be said that it's actually quite terrifying, just like monsters in the legends, who can grasp your minds. As she recalled, Audrey couldn't help but sigh inwardly. Smine was somewhat unaccustomed to horse riding as she carefully circled the area and said, "Stowen University's Associate Professor Michel is a collector. We wish for you to purchase a notebook from the 20-Year War." The 20-Year War referred to a war between the Loan Kingdom and Faesac Empire in the 5th Epic's year 621 to 642. The former was defeated and lost the ancient Elves Island, which was present-day Sonia Island. Stowen University, Professor Michel. Notebook from the 20-Year War era. Audrey extracted the key terms in the words and glanced at Susie, who was running happily in front of the mare. She went straight to the point by asking, "Ma'am Smine, what kind of notebook is it?" "I'm not sure. All I know is that it belongs to the period of the 20-Year War. It's part of Associate Professor Michel's collection. It has an important characteristic, the patterns on the cover faintly forms a dragon." Smine didn't hide it from Audrey as she told her all the information she knew. Audrey, who silently listened to her descriptions, restrained her burgundy mare as she considered how she could complete the mission. Visit Associate Professor Michel and view his collections before raising a request to buy one of the items isn't too difficult. Although it's embarrassing to admit this, it's quite unlikely he would reject me regardless of the way it's said. Yes, Audrey, you shouldn't be overly reliant on these. The biggest problem is being out of the blue. I didn't know Associate Professor Michel before this, making it very difficult to explain why I'm suddenly visiting him. Besides, I don't know what the notebook means to him. Announcing my desire to purchase it might result in him being alert and wary. Jen's elder brother is studying at Stowen University. At the last gathering, he depicted his penchant for describing and discussing matters. If I were to invite him and his sister to the next afternoon tea and steer the topic towards history, archaeology, or collections, then he will likely mention Associate Professor Michel. Yes, at a university, there's definitely not many people who can be called collectors. With such a precursor, I can send someone to pay a visit to Associate Professor Michel and make the request to view his collection. At the first meeting, I'll try my best not to show my desire for it. I'll observe the owner's actions and guide him to reveal his true self. This will be helpful for me to use suitable matters for suitable requests at a suitable time. After confirming her line of thought, Audrey nodded at Smine and smiled. I'll work hard to complete the mission, but I can't guarantee success. Just as she said that, she tightened the girth before shooting forward like an arrow, heading straight for a reddish-brown fox that was darting around in a hunting encirclement. Above the tumultuous sea, the Blue Avenger was like a leaf tumbling amidst heavy squalls. From time to time, it would be thrown up before crashing back into the waves, but it maintained a stunning sense of balance without any signs of capsizing. Inside the captain's cabin, Alger Wilson was floating around the window as he looked at the waves outside, which were as high as mountains. There were forceful winds blowing around him in silence. Some time later, he landed his feet onto the carpet. Wind Blessed is indeed a sequence that can be easily acted, based on its name. The only problem is that it occasionally makes me irascible, completely matching the characteristics of a gale. Alger sighed inwardly without any delight. Over the past 2 months or so, he had failed to obtain the Ocean Songster formula through his own resource channels and the Tarot Club's trades. After all, it was that of a sequence 5, the sequence closest to a demigod. The corresponding formula was already something where demand far outstripped supply. Even with boatloads of money and the willingness to pay a premium, it was very difficult to buy one. Normally speaking, joining the corresponding church or organization was the most effective method of obtaining the corresponding formula, but as a Church of Storms bishop, Alger was unable to rely on this method. Due to particular secrets, he needed to hide his strength in order to win the freedom he needed to take action and be under light monitoring. Only after he had sufficient confidence would he head for a place and complete the goal he had been waiting for all this time. To his joy, he didn't waste the past 2 months. At the very least, the speed at which he digested the wind-blessed potion was pretty decent. The wind-blessed is simple. Ocean Songster is said to be quite difficult. Must I frequently sing? Alger couldn't help but turn his head and look towards the deck. Although he was separated from them by several rooms, he could still hear the drunken sailors singing with gusto, creating a din that could rival the storm's roars. Alger unknowingly frowned. Backland, Sherwood Borough. Synth Circus. Ma'am, didn't you say that you're performing magic? Why are you dressed like that? A youth asked the woman dressed in a pitch-black pointed hat and dress of the same color in puzzlement. I don't know why I'm wearing this as well. Perhaps it's because of my first appearance here. My brain was freezing from the weather and my style was subsequently fixed. Furs rubbed her face, which had red and yellow paint, as she replied with a smile, in ancient times, magic is often mistaken as witchcraft. But this has nothing to do with why I'm wearing this. She picked up the middle of 3 porcelain cups which were placed in front of her. She then placed a white ball beneath it. Then, she quickly switched the positions of the cups before smiling at the youth who had questioned her. Guess where the tiny ball is? Isn't this one of the gambling methods invented by Emperor Roussel? The youth said with piqued interest. But you aren't a croupier, but a trickmaster at a circus. Therefore, I believe that the ball has already been switched away. All the cups are empty. Furs smiled and said, Congratulations, you got it wrong. She suddenly picked up the cup in the middle as a white blur flew out. It was a dove. As for the tiny ball from before, it was where the dove had left. Wow! Godly! Wonderful magic! Brilliant! After a series of amazed exclamations, Furs clearly looked pleased with herself as she looked at the distant cathedral bell, put away her props, and returned to the tent where the circus master resided. Are you really resigning? I can double your salary. The circus master came over as he tried to persuade her otherwise. Unfortunately, I had already summarized the trickmaster principles by the middle of March and had already completely digested the potion last week. If it wasn't because the contract ended today, I wouldn't even be here today. Although being a trickmaster feels very nice, this doesn't stop me from my goal of advancing to astrologer. Teacher said that he would be giving me the formula, ingredients, and a gift this week. What kind of gift will it be? Sigh, the ravings from the full moon are getting more terrifying. If not for Mr. Fool, I definitely would have lost control and become a monster. Furs extended her right hand and covered her mouth, languidly yawning. Then, she said with a smile, well, I'm actually a best-selling author. My next book is related to circuses, so I came here to be hired. A best-selling author? The circus master's eyes lit up as he said worriedly and expectantly, will you write bad things about us? Are there any? I had a great time for the past 2 months. Furs took off her pointed black hat. The circus master revealed a sincere smile and said, Wall, ma'am Wall, can you mention our circus's name in your book? I'll pay you advertisement fees. Of course, it won't be much. As you know, I'm responsible for the livelihoods of many people. That can be done? This circus master is quite smart. For the first time, Furs realized that a novel could advertise, just like in newspapers or magazines. Furthermore, the format was more obscure and natural. Amidst waves, a liner with rows of cannons traveled along a safe sea route without daring to deviate far from it. Any deviation from the sea route east of Oravi Island usually meant disappearing. Even pirates didn't dare to stray too far from the safe zones. This sea was filled with unexplored regions, filled with all sorts of sensational legends. After 2 months of volunteer work and finding 4 chances to engage in true acting, Klein bade farewell to carrying patients, scrubbing toilet bowls, cleaning vomit, and other miscellaneous chores. He boarded a ship headed for the Gargaz archipelago. At the tarot gathering in early March, he had hired the hermit Catalya in a private conversation. He would meet her at the capital of Gargaz archipelago, the city of White, Naz. He would then board her ship and head for the dangerous ocean, which was close to an illusion, on the far east of the Sonia Sea. There, he would search for unaffiliated mermaids who lived there. The hermit Catalya seemed to be very interested in meeting members of the tarot club in the real world. With just a few seconds of thought, she agreed to the world's request. However, due to the high level of danger, she had given a high asking price. £3,000. Klein's first reaction was to give up and take Mr. Hanged Man's ghost ship, but considering how there would be many sailors from the Church of Storms following him, making his freedom limited, and the fact that the level of danger in the easternmost area of the Sonia Sea was high, he finally accepted Ma'am Hermit's condition. As for her, she would wait around the Gargaz archipelago for a month at the beginning of April. Any delay would imply the end of the cooperation. To not waste the £1,000 deposit, Klein didn't wait to complete his digestion before heading for Gargaz archipelago from Oravi Island. Of course, with the summaries and chances at true acting from before, he was already very close to completely digesting the faceless potion. Even if he didn't use true acting, just acting in his capacity as Gehrman Sparrow was enough to complete the digestion in 2 to 3 weeks. Due to this reason, as well as the world's identity being tied with Gehrman Sparrow, Klein transformed back into the lunatic and powerful adventurer once he left the hospital. However, he did disguise himself to a certain degree. As he watched the perturbed sea surface, Klein finally saw a port city that had houses mainly made of white rock. The most eastern front of the Fasak Empire, the capital of the Gargaz archipelago, Naz. I'm finally overseas. Klein looked at a fishing boat carrying whale meat cruising into the harbor. Its ruggedness wasn't concealed. Meanwhile, he discovered several ships hanging pirate flags docked at the harbor without any signs of concealment. Indeed, Oravi Island's eastern front is a playground for pirates. Klein wore his hat and carried his luggage and left the cabin after the liner came to a stable halt. He went down the gangway into the harbor. After a few steps, he saw a crew of pirates seemingly entering conflict with a local gang. Both sides drew their weapons as they clashed. Klein calmly walked past, showing no signs of stopping them. At that moment, he saw a local pull out a few cans from his pocket and open the lid before throwing it into the middle of the road. What's the meaning of this? Klein nearly laughed out before recalling an infamous item at sea. Canned wolf fish. Canned wolf fish was popular on the east coast of Fasak and the Gargaz archipelago. Just as the thought surfaced, an indescribable stench seemed to inundate Klein's olfactory senses. His facial muscles twitched as he tried hard to resist his body's discomfort as he quickly left the region. A small number of pirates who were struck by the stench vomited immediately, while the remaining ones frantically fled while dragging their companions as though they had lost all their combat strength. A minute later, in a secluded corner, the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, crouched down and silently belched. The smell of canned wolffish is really pungent. Not only is it smelly, but it's also disgusting. It's practically a biological weapon. Klein crouched in the corner and took nearly a minute to recover. Before that very instant, he had underestimated canned wolffish. He had failed to take the necessary actions to deal with the situation. He could have used paper figurine substitutes or create an invisible air tube to pretend that he was using underwater breathing, but he had done none of that. Now, he finally got a deep understanding of how wise it was to ban opening canned wolffish in public. Phew, Klein exhaled as he slowly stood up. Carrying his suitcase, he slowly walked towards the harbor. His first impression of the city named Naz was one of many white houses, with stone being a common material for the buildings. The second impression was that it wasn't too far north, but the temperature was rather cold. Even though it was already April, it was still only a few degrees Celsius. The third impression was that there were many whaling houses. Gigantic beluga whales were being dismembered for their skin, flesh, fat, bones, and gray amber. The latter two could be used to make pannier for banquet dresses or top-grade scented materials. Whether it was for incense or perfume, they were considered luxurious goods that only the wealthy and nobles could enjoy. As for the skin, flesh, and fat of beluga whales, they also had their own uses. They were used separately to make clothes, food, or oil-related products. In Naz and the Gargaz archipelago, the culinary methods for preparing beluga whale had transformed into a unique culture. There were all sorts of techniques and famous restaurants. Klein passed by the various whaling houses, seeing separated fat being carried out on cargo carriages towards nearby factories that spewed black smoke. They were oil refineries which were very unique to Gargaz. Beluga whale fat could be refined into whale oil which could be bottled and made into outstanding incendiary material and the lifeblood of particular industries. Very unique. Klein exhaled some mist as he stopped and watched for a while. Out of the harbor and into the city district, a cacophony of Fasak inundated his ears. Having mastered ancient Fasak, the source of the northern continent's language, Klein was long familiar with the language of the northern continent barbarians. He turned his head upon hearing the din and saw the tall populace with slightly blonde hair raising horizontal banners as they protested on the streets. The horizontal banner right at the front clearly wrote the reasons for their protest. Oppose the poaching of beluga whales. We need sustainable development. Peeved, Klein nearly lost his cool as he believed that the concept of sustainable development was highly likely to be invented by Emperor Russell. As he swept his gaze, he looked at the banners behind it and understood the goals of the protest. Whaling for survival, not entertainment. Humans aren't more important than beluga whales. Greedy devils should leave Nas. At this moment, a policeman dressed in a grey uniform held a shield, riot fork, and baton to stop the protesters from advancing. After a brief argument, the scene quickly turned violent. Many protesting youths threw open canned wolffish, as well as Molotov cocktails. The police didn't show restraint as they forged forward, raising their shields and striking with their batons. Klein pinched his nose as he watched the fire burning on the street. He realized that many passers-by were completely unfazed. Apart from a small bunch of spectators, the rest continued proceeding to their destinations. It appears that such things happen often in Nas. Do protests develop into riots? As expected of the Fasak Empire, Klein mumbled to himself, circled the street, and casually found an inn to stay. He continued registering as Gehrman Sparrow, unworried that the news released by Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy would cause the Church of the Evernight Goddess to view him as a faceless. This was because he had no plans on traveling through the whale fishing routes to find mermaids who were believers of the goddess. He planned on heading to the dangerous region farthest east from the Sonia Sea. As for the safety in the Gargaz archipelago, there was nothing he needed to worry about. This was a colony of the Fasak Empire. The only legal church was the Church of the God of Combat. They were enemies with the Church of the Evernight Goddess. Klein was originally worried that he would encounter many faceless here, meeting 7 or 8 faceless simply from going next door to enjoy some whale cuisine. However, after serious consideration, he rationally eliminated this possibility. First, Beyonders from the Seer pathway were rare to begin with. Klein had only met 3 Beyonders who were beyond Sequence 8, and second, Sequence 6 Beyonders weren't commonly seen. Even in a playground for pirates, those who had 5,000-pound bounties were considered rare creatures. Third, once a faceless had many preparations, they would seek out mermaids on a whaling boat. They would either begin having faith in the goddess, sink to the bottom of the ocean, or become research personnel. Otherwise, the extremely smart ones would seize the opportunity and successfully advance before leaving safely. It was very rare for them to stay on Gargaz archipelago for long. In all of Nas, excluding myself, there wouldn't be more than 2 faceless. Klein straightened his clothes as he wasn't in a rush to contact Admiral of Stars Catalya. He came onto the streets in a good mood and began searching for delicacies according to what he heard on his travels. Raw beluga whale slices, fried whale steak, whale oil with skin, roasted whale meat. Like a standard traveler, Klein restaurant hopped thrice and sampled different food. Not bad. It's pretty unique and it's not very fishy. Instead, it's very appetizing and alluring. Burp. Klein covered his mouth as he came onto the streets. He discovered that the street lamps were sparse, but the lights from the houses lining the streets were bright. To a certain extent, they reduced the darkness of the night. Ice-cold winds passed through the ocean, causing Klein to raise his hand to prop up his collar. The blue cufflinks had their lusters restrained as they were deeply embedded at his wrists. Compared to rings, items like cufflinks were more suited to Gehrman Sparrow's persona. Therefore, Klein didn't blame the artisan for making changes without his permission. As for the harmonica that had fixed the summoning ritual of a spirit world creature, it matched Klein's inward intentions completely. It could be used for 1.5 years. It was silver in color, exquisite and beautiful. When he received the harmonica, Klein had imagined such a scene, a crazy and powerful adventurer playing a sad tune on the harmonica in a silent night under the dark moonlight by the side of a boat. Unfortunately, the harmonica couldn't produce any sound, and it could only be used to summon Reinette Tinnicker. Shaking his head indiscernibly, Klein steadily walked down the empty and cold Nas streets before returning to his inn. Using sleep to bring himself back to an optimal state, he went to Grey Amber Street the next morning and entered a sundry store named Hot Whale Dance. Upon seeing the grizzled boss who was a head taller than him, Klein tapped the counter and said in Fasak, "Whale oil." The boss had wrinkles plastered across his face, but he only wore a coat made of beluga whaleskin. The light-colored patterns had a strange beauty. How much? The boss was drinking large mouthfuls of liquor, ignoring the messy placement of the goods. 1.25 buckets, Klein replied according to the predetermined secret password. The boss's drinking actions instantly slowed down as he placed the cup of brownish-green alcohol onto the bar counter. "Do you want to try some? It's many times purer than Nepos." It's considered the mistress of all Faisac men. This was a distilled liquor that's a specialty of Faisac. It's brewed with potatoes or grain. The alcohol purity was high, as stimulating and famous as Blaze. Compared to Sonia Bloodwine, its price was rather low, and it was well liked by ordinary Faisacians. There's no need. Klein shook his head. The boss chuckled. What kind of man are you if you don't drink Nepos? Are there only women in Lowen? He mumbled before drinking another mouthful. Who introduced you here? Ma'am Germises. Klein said a name in the style of the local customs. The boss exhaled, causing a strong scent of distilled liquor to linger in the air. He staggered as he got up, like a polar bear performing at a circus. After giving the store employee instructions, he brought Klein to a tiny room on the second story of the warehouse at the back. Let me search for it. Let's see, the boss mumbled as he crouched. Klein controlled the twitching of his facial muscles as he recalled a widely spread joke in the Lowen Kingdom. When is a Faisac man not drunk? When he's in his mother's womb. After waiting for a moment, Klein saw the boss find a pure crystal ball from his rummaging. Then, the tipsy polar bear had his back facing Klein as he rubbed his hands on it, softly chanting the tongue-twisting ancient Hermes. The room gradually turned dark as all the corners without light sank like they were producing a strange attractive force. The crystal ball quickly lit up, producing the figure of a woman wearing a black, classic robe. She had an oval face and had very fair skin. Her eyes were deep black with a slight purple hue which was filled with mystery. I'm seeing another Tarot Club member's actual appearance again. Klein stepped forward and received the crystal ball. On the opposite end of the crystal ball, the hermit Catalya could also clearly see the world. He had black hair and brown eyes, with a thin and angular face. Her gaze paused for a moment before she hesitantly said, Gehrman Sparrow? She discovered that the true strength and standards of the Tarot Club members were far stronger than she had expected. The world was actually the crazy hunter, Gehrman Sparrow, who was considered at the level of a pirate admiral. My various assumptions of the world were problematic. Controlled, staid, experienced, and ruthless. Admiral of Stars didn't feel overly surprised. Yes, Ma'am Catalya. Klein gestured for the boss to leave the room. After it became extremely quiet, Admiral of Stars Catalya asked once again, I'm very curious. How did you recognize my identity? I've been very careful when participating in the gatherings. Of course, she had jumped in fright when the world, who had chosen to speak privately with her, immediately greeted her with, Admiral of Stars. And it was partly because of this that she chose to take on the world's commission. A secret. Klein smiled politely. As he didn't wish for her to make connections to Mr. Fool, he calmly added, Your eyes are very special. Can I understand that as a form of praise? Catalya smiled, feeling somewhat enlightened. She believed that the world had previously only relied on her eyes and other details to suspect that she was Admiral of Stars, but she wasn't certain. Hence, he had probed her with language, and her reaction told him the correct answer. Klein didn't respond as he switched to asking, When can we set off? Admiral of Stars Catalya thought before answering, Tonight at 8. Dock 6. Not bad. There's no delay at all. Klein nodded slightly. Okay. Just as he said that, the light inside the crystal ball suddenly converged as the figure dressed in a black, classic robe darkened and blurred before quickly vanishing. Holding the crystal ball which had turned very ordinary, Klein turned around, pulled open the door, and walked out. Glancing at the boss who was guzzling alcohol while leaning against a wall, he threw the crystal ball at him. The boss fumbled to catch it as Klein unhurriedly walked down the stairs and left the warehouse. Once he was out of Hot Whale Dance, he took out his golden pocket watch and snapped it open to check the time. It's almost noon. Most bars will be open. Klein stopped a rental carriage and used Faisac to tell the driver to head to the Lairdal Bar. It meant Dawn Bar in the local language. It was a place where adventurers would gather in the Gargaz archipelago. To Klein, the gathering of different intel and news was meaningful. This might aid him in making the best judgment at critical points in time, allowing him to escape the misfortune of losing his life. Therefore, even if he didn't like bars, he often went there. He would get a cup of thick malt beer and silently sit in the corner of the bar counter and listen to any matters of interest which people mentioned at sea. In addition, he wanted to know about Roy King, who had been imprisoned in Biam's Governor-General's office. Over the past 2 months, Snake of Mercury Will Ossepton hadn't sent him any dreams. Similarly, Fate Counselor Ricciardo didn't summon his messenger to provide him any clues to a powerful mystical item. About 20 minutes later, the carriage came to a halt. A huge vertical signboard with the words Lerdelbar appeared before Klein's eyes. He habitually took out 2 soldi in notes and handed them to the carriage driver. It was only when he saw the worn face of the carriage driver did he suddenly realize something. He was overseas and this was a colony of Fasak. It had its own currency. The smallest denomination was the kopeck, followed by the fey silver, and then the gold horn. They maintained the very intuitive base 10 denomination, making conversions very simple. I forgot to visit the bank to exchange for kopeck and fey silver. I used it all at the inn and restaurant. Klein was just about to look around to see if there were any banks around when the carriage driver happily received the 2 1 soldi notes. After repeatedly checking it, he beamed with his wrinkled face. Thank you for your generosity. Klein got off the carriage. While walking towards the Lerdelbar, he was recalling the carriage driver's delighted look. Gold pounds, soldi, and pence can be used here as well? Yes, Garga's archipelago isn't that far from Tosgarter and Oravi. Many items would be sold here, and many Loan adventurers like to visit the Sea of Beluga whales. To have Loan Kingdom's currency being used in private is rather common. Loan's industry and economic strength is greater than the Fasak Empire. It can even be said to be much stronger. The gold pound is worth a lot more than the gold horn. Wait. Suddenly, he recalled something. 1 gold pound could be used to exchange for 5.5 gold horn. This also meant that 2 soldi was equal to 5.5 fey silver. And in the city of White, a rental carriage cost 4 fey silver an hour. There wasn't any prorated discounts. It was no wonder the carriage driver was so happy. Klein turned back and realized that the carriage had long disappeared. Sigh. Gently exhaling, Klein pressed down on his hat and pushed open the heavy wooden door before entering the Lerdelbar. In this world, bars near the dock and factory districts often sold lunch and dinner. Therefore, they opened around 11 in the morning. At that moment, there were quite a number of adventurers, who had nothing better to do, gathered in front of the bar counter. They ordered liquor and smoked fish or vegetable soup with oil floating on the surface. They had a great time eating all of that with bread. Drinking Lanti Proof and Nepos at noon? Are they planning to be drunk the entire day? The customs of Fasak are really unacceptable. Klein mumbled as he walked to the bar counter with a deadpan expression. He sat in a corner and rapped the wooden counter. 2 toasted bread with red sausage, a set of smoked whale meat, a bowl of thick vegetable soup, and a cup of Gola's beer. Gola's beer was rather popular along the eastern seaboard of Fasak. It was rather rare in Sonia Island and the Garga's archipelago. New here? The bartender glanced at Klein. A total of 4 fey silver and 6 kopeck. I'm new because I don't drink liquor? Klein ignored the bartender's question and threw 2 soldi in notes. It was equivalent to 5 fey silver and 5 kopeck. Considering how he was Gehrman Sparrow, Klein held back the urge to get the bartender to give him change as he treated it as a tip. Of course, in a Backland bar, that amount of food would have cost him about 2 soldi. Having received a tip, the bartender didn't ask further. He skillfully poured a cup of Gola's beer and pushed it towards Klein. The beer was rather black in color with plenty of foam. It had a pleasant charred taste, and there was slight stimulation in the mellow taste. It made Klein feel as though the alcohol content was rather high as he suspected if some other liquor had been poured in. While waiting for his food, he sipped his beer and silently listened to the conversations of the surrounding adventurers. And the group's conversation was mainly centered around how someone had made a windfall, who was killed by pirates, who finished off a pirate captain without claiming the bounty and instead inherited the deceased pirate captain's subordinates, which woman in Nas had an illegitimate child, or who became a laughing stock for failing to perform at a brothel. When the Garga's specialty, thick soup brewed using sweet vegetables, onions, cabbage, carrots, fish, and butter, was served before Klein, he finally heard something interesting. An adventurer suppressed his voice as he said to his surroundings partners, "Have you heard of this? There's a 4th epic ruin east of Garga's." "No. Who discovered it?" his surprised partner curiously asked. The adventurer looked to his left and right as he said without much thought, "Gareth discovered it. As you know, he's a seafarer who's good at diving. As he was drunk, he was thrown off the deck and sank to the bottom of the sea. Who knew that he ended up discovering remnants of steel buildings? They were definitely steel buildings made from human hands. And then?" his partner pressed. The adventurer chuckled. Gareth followed the ruins and discovered an abandoned sea well of unknown depths. It was already filled with seawater, but it still left him with extreme horror. Holy Lord of Storms, this might even lead to the core of the land. He said that there was something summoning him inside, but he didn't dare explore it. So he floated up in fear. A deep sea well. Strange attraction. This might not be a fourth epic ruin. Perhaps it's from the third epic or second epic. Little Sun had mentioned that during the Dark Epic, sea monsters were subject to Elf King Soniathrum and helped him rule the bottom of the sea. Sweet, salty, and a little tartish. Klein drank a mouthful of thick vegetable soup as he forked a piece of smoked beluga whale meat. The adventurers didn't talk about Gareth's encounter, as there wasn't any sight of heart-stirring gold or jewelry, mystical items, or Beyonder ingredients at the moment. The conversation quickly steered to a few adventurers who they weren't friendly with. They mocked about how they had married beautiful natives who all turned into stout and fat women a couple of years later. Their strength could even match those of low-sequence Beyonders. Finally, they concluded that it might have to do with how people from Faceac had tiny bits of giant blood running in their veins. They didn't say anything of value until Klein finished his lunch and drank his beer, but the number of people inside Lerdelbar kept increasing. Suddenly, the heavy door was pushed open as it slammed into the wall. A top hat-donning young man who was clearly of Loan blood rushed in. He shouted nervously, "Is there anyone from the Adventurer Association?" "Yes, Bilt still owes me the creation of one item." Klein watched as the young men looked around frantically while constantly turning his head back. It appeared as though someone was pursuing him. Before he could consider whether to render assistance, 3 adventurers stood up from different corners. One of them was more than 2 meters tall. He had wide shoulders and firm muscles. His hair was slightly blonde, and his eyes were a deep blue. He was rather eye-catching. The strength he appears to have matches with his substance. This isn't a Beyonder of quite a significant sequence. Klein retracted his gaze as he became a spectator once again as he looked out the door. Soon, a man in a linen shirt and brown jacket appeared. He was of medium build, and his lips were purple. His brown eyes could hardly conceal the intense baneful look he tried to hide. Klein instantly connected the man to a portrait on a bounty. It was the second mate of the King of Immortality Agolito, Slaughter Kirkais, with a bounty of 9,500 pounds. This is a notorious pirate. Klein's nerves tensed up as his gaze locked onto the man. He naturally hung his left hand down as his body prepared to lunge forward. Kirkais swept his gaze at the 2-meter-tall giant, and saw Klein before retracting his gaze. He turned to leave the Lerdelbar without stopping at all. Very decisive, very alert. Klein frowned slightly, confident that he hadn't revealed any killing intent. He had even controlled his gaze very well. Was he worried about that giant, or is his intuition very sharp to a particular extent? Just like the premonition towards danger like devils? Klein wondered as he drank the remaining Gola's beer without participating in the private conversations of the Adventurer Association members. He left the bar and came onto the streets. Now, he didn't wish to give himself new troubles aside from finding mermaids. After circling the area, Klein discovered that Slaughterer Kirkais had long departed. His whereabouts were unknown. Hence, he silently returned to his inn. City of Silver. Inside the spire, Derek Berg once again met the chief of the 6-member council, Colin Iliad. He clearly remembered that nearly 70 days ago, Colin had told him that in 2 months he should prepare to be sent out on an exploration mission. "Are you done with your preparations?" Colin had his back to the window as he asked without any abnormality in his tone. With the axe of Hurricane attached to him, Derek lowered his head slightly. "I'm done." In the past 2 months, through the patrol missions and arduous practice, he had fully mastered the various Beyonder powers of Solar High Priest. He was already not too far from digesting the potion. What he wished for the most was to obtain the Sun Pathways Sequence 6 potion formula in the next 2 to 3 tarot gatherings, so as to ensure his continual advancement. The release of Shepherd Lovia made him feel highly threatened. He believed that only by reaching the same Sequence 5 would he have a chance of effectively putting her in check and avert the potential danger of the City of Silver. However, with the knowledge of the acting method and without the lack of Beyonder ingredients, all he needed to do was survive the various patrols and exploration missions and make enough contributions to make Sequence 6 a reachable target. However, Sequence 5 required a specific ritual which made it relatively difficult. The grizzled Colin nodded. "In another 2 days, I'll be leading a small team to the vicinity of the Giant King's Court. We will do a second sweep of Afternoon Town which we previously found, and your powers are very suitable for such matters." Afternoon Town. Having been brushing up on his knowledge of legends over the past few months, Derek was no stranger to this name. It was an area that needed to be passed when going to the Giant King's court from the Kingdom of Silver. It was a town where humans and giants lived together. It clustered around the ancient god's residence, which was forever fixed at sunset, just like the last door that separated the real world to a mythological legend. Yes, Your Excellency. Derek couldn't find a reason to reject. City of White, Nas. In a particular inn. Klein sat behind a desk as he looked at the constantly changing clouds outside the window, silently awaiting the arrival of evening. At 8, he would board the Star Pirates' flagship, Future, on Dock 6 to head to the furthest eastern front of the Sonia Sea. No matter what happened in the Gargaz archipelago or this region of the sea known as a pirate's playground, they would have nothing to do with him. Therefore, he didn't attempt to hunt the small number of pirates with bounties on their heads that he met while walking in the big and small alleys or bars and casinos. He didn't want to mess up his plans of finding mermaids. My spiritual intuition tells me that Slaughter Kirkais from Noon seems to have targeted me. I wouldn't mind if he wishes to send himself to his death. Well, battle strategy can be despised, but battle technique needs to be treated seriously. Without using the sea god's scepter or tinder, I'm at best a little stronger than him. I'm at an advantage by being well-rounded and strange enough. Klein half closed his eyes as he imagined the gathering of countless spherical lights, and he used it to enter cogitation rapidly so as to maintain the acuteness of his spirituality. After an unknown period of time, his spiritual perception was triggered as he opened his eyes immediately. At that moment, the sun had already set in the west. The fiery red colors seemed to burn the sea as long shadows were drawn out through the curtains. The shadows seemed to come alive as they danced about before distorting and standing up to project themselves on the wall. Its pitch-black darkness was like the manifestation of the immense evil at the bottom of a human's heart. Klein watched this scene with a deadpan expression. He raised his left palm high as he slowly extended his fingers. The pitch-black shadow produced a voice that sounded hoarse, as though it held sandcloth in it. While looking at Klein, it said, "Gehrman Sparrow, do not interfere in the matter that happened this afternoon. This is the will of the King of Immortality." With that said, the shadow slid down like flowing water and scattered into the darkness, having its original state restored. Klein didn't pay attention to the shadow's changes. Instead, he cast his gaze outside. He could sense that the person controlling the shadow was somewhere across the street. Hence, he didn't plan on acting upon an incorporeal entity. Indeed, Slaughterer Kirkais recognized me as the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, who loves to hunt pirates. That's why he didn't hesitate to turn around at noon. He might not be afraid of me, but there was another rather powerful adventurer present as well. The power he revealed just now is somewhat similar to the Desire Apostle in Backlund. He's more and more likely to be a Beyander from the Devil Pathway. Hey, using the King of Immortality to scare me. Do you think I'll submit just like that? I never intended to involve myself in it. By doing so, I'm actually a little curious. Forget it. Finding the mermaids is of utmost importance as of now. I shouldn't create incidents for myself. Klein retracted his gaze as he lampooned. He was originally wondering if he should report the matter to the Church of the God of Combat in Nas, but after serious consideration, he discovered that it was likely to be meaningless. The Church of the God of Combat is the only legal religion in the Fasak Empire. The number of high-sequence Beyonders they have is definitely a little higher than the Church of the Evernight Goddess, but just by a little. Even if the demigods of the Fasak royal family and military are added, with the extensive land and numerous colonies it has, making the number of critical areas that require protection crucial, they would definitely be lacking in manpower. The Gargaz archipelago, which is far away from the empire and in a relatively ordinary location, with the only industry being whale fishing, there's no doubt that it's only an afterthought and doesn't have any saints protecting it. According to what Klein had previously learned, the Archbishop of the Gargaz Diocese for the Church of the God of Combat was only a Sequence 5 guardian. Together with the Tribunal's Inquisitor, a Baron from the royal family, and a Commodore from the military, they form the highest level of Beyander combat forces here. Of course, the existence of sealed artifacts had guaranteed the control of the area. Klein suspected that the Church of the God of Combat in Nas had at least one Grade 1 sealed artifact. Only by doing so could they combine it with their fleets and Beyonders to ensure that the whale oil and grey amber trade industry wouldn't be under the control of pirates and not end up as one of the vassals of one of the four kings. Under any sudden assaults, they were able to use it to last until reinforcements arrived. And it was precisely because of this that the officials in the Gargaz archipelago ultimately maintained a defensive state. As long as the pirates didn't cause problems, they were allowed to freely enter and leave. Reporting things wouldn't be of any use. No wonder it's called a pirate's playground. It's no wonder Bilt wants to organize an adventurer association. Klein sighed as he gave up his previous thoughts. After dinner and resting for a while, Klein took out his gold pocket watch and opened it to check the time. Seeing that it was already 7, he held a ritual and summoned himself before responding to himself. He then brought different items into the gray fog while adjusting his inventory. As he was adventuring out at sea on the future, the Murloc cufflink and various Seagod domain charms were necessary. Therefore, Klein left Tinder and the sunbrooch above the gray fog. With creeping hunger as his main force, he matched it with a biological poison bottle and a revolver which was loaded with different Beander bullets. He still had 7 purifying bullets, 13 demon hunting bullets, and 2 exorcism bullets. Wearing his coat, Klein placed down Azek's whistle, as well as his wallet containing only 50 pounds into his inner pocket. Then, he stored the silver adventurer harmonica and charms together. After doing all of this, he touched the revolver beneath his armpit, polished the blue cufflink at his left wrist, and buttoned his double-breasted frock coat. He wore his half-top hat, picked up his black suitcase which contained only his change of clothes and some daily necessities, and left the inn for the harbor via a carriage. After waiting for a while at Dock 6, he saw a gigantic sailboat slowly appear from the distance. According to his limited knowledge of boats, Klein knew that a sailboat of such length wasn't scientific. However, this didn't deter it from cruising calmly on the Black Sea surface as it headed for the lighthouse which emitted its light. As the sailboat approached, the flag gradually became clear. The crimson but weak moonlight allowed the people at the harbor to see 10 white stars of the same size as they circled a cold eyelashless eye on the flag. Admiral of Stars. The future. The pirates and sailors who were watching over their ships exclaimed as every dock in the harbor was filled with stirred emotions. After more than 10 seconds, the defensive cannons on the two ends of the mountain, nervously, adjusted themselves and aimed at the gigantic sailboat which didn't conceal itself. Clang! 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 The distant cathedral produced light and ethereal chimes, signaling that it was 8 o'clock sharp. As the tenseness around the dock became more evident, the future came to a halt. At some point in time, a woman dressed in a black classical robe appeared at the bow. Her clothes were filled with different symbols and magic labels, making her look like a powerful warlock of ancient legends. Under the crimson moonlight, the ground beneath her suddenly lit up. Resplendent starlight scattered down, forming a long, transparent bridge. The long bridge constantly extended forward before landing on Dock 6. An impressive show, as expected of one of the 7 pirate admirals. Furthermore, she's a full admiral, a rank higher than Iceberg and Ailment. Klein sighed as he wished to extend his palm to cover his face. He didn't wish to let others know that the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, was cooperating with Admiral of Stars Catalya. At this point, I can only maintain my persona. Once I'm done digesting the potion and by the time I'm back in the northern continent, there wouldn't be Gehrman Sparrow anymore. Klein walked out of the shadows as he pressed the half-top hat on his head. He smoothly walked onto the starry bridge. His footsteps were firm as Klein walked with his back straight while being targeted by numerous defensive cannons. Under the gazes with ambiguous meanings, he unhurriedly walked to the docked future. The bridge under his feet was transparent as the dark blue seawater which was almost black ebbed beneath him. It would make anyone with acrophobia turn limp. Thankfully, I've long become a clown. I've even jumped off a clock tower. Klein covered the last 10 meters with a cold expression before stepping onto the deck of the future. Faced with the black-eyed Admiral of Stars Catalya, who had purple tint to her eyes, he didn't show any nervousness. He took off his hat and bowed. "Good evening, ma'am." While Klein bowed, the purple tint in black-haired Catalya's eyes converged as they seemed to turn into an abyss that could suck up souls. What already exuded an air of mystery had turned even more obvious. She saw that the astral projection deep inside Gehrman Sparrow's ether body was pure darkness. In minute areas, there were dark flows with unending changes. She saw that Gehrman Sparrow's left hand was bright and lustrous, but it was stained with a sanguine color that couldn't be dispersed. She saw a blue luster by Gehrman Sparrow's wrist and a silver flow on his left pocket. The colors were bright and obvious as though they were connected to the illusory, stacked spirit world. There was the sound of the tide and the illusory sounds of wind surrounding the items. She saw an intermix of green and black lusters by Gehrman Sparrow's right pocket, as well as 2 points of golden, silver, and bronze under his armpit. At his chest, there was a deep grayish-white like rotting death. 4 mystical items and Beander artifacts or spirituality charms in units of 10. Catalya's eyes were a little dazzled as she couldn't help but close them for a moment. She nodded as well. "Good evening, Mr. Sparrow." Even as a powerhouse who was famous across the seas, a senior member of the 7 pirate admirals, she seldom saw people who armed themselves to the teeth with Beyonder items. Of course, she had also seen people with more mystical items, Beyonder artifacts, and spirituality charms, but they had secret organizations backing them. They typically had several ships and more than 1,000 pirates under them. Many things needed to be turned in, split and shared, as well as sold in order to maintain and strengthen one's faction. Few things could be left in their possession as a result. However, few was relative. They could compare with what Gehrman Sparrow presently had, but Catalya had reduced her items to only 2 after several trades. They were 2 items that were sufficiently powerful and mystical enough to match her identity as a pirate admiral. Apart from the lusters representing different items, Catalya's black eyes, which were slightly purple, could also tell that Gehrman wasn't real enough. He seemed to be hidden behind thick curtains. This is the reason why he gives me the feeling like he's not a living person at the Tarot Club? He has quite a number of secrets. It involves at least a Sequence 3 saint or an even higher level angel. Catalya didn't dare take another look as the glow in her eyes were no longer as profound. Meanwhile, she mocked herself, believing that some of her guesses about the world and Gehrman Sparrow were somewhat funny. Involves a Sequence 3 saint or an even higher leveled angel. Heh, there's nothing wrong with that, since he's like me, a member of the Tarot Club. We're definitely involved with Mr. Fool, who's likely a reawakened ancient god. After exchanging greetings, Catalya didn't engage in further small talk. She led Klein towards the cabin. At this moment, the Future, which had been docked, set sail again. A long contour was drawn on the surface of the sea as it cruised east of the whale fishing route. With that, the tense atmosphere at the Nas harbor dispersed. Gazes from various sailors were cast over. Klein didn't show any signs of pressure as he surveyed the area and said with a tone as though he was back in his own home, "There are fewer people than I expected." Catalya turned her head and glanced at him before answering simply, "East of the whaling route is very dangerous. Only Ludwell heads there frequently as though he's searching for something. Apart from the Future, the pirate crew's other ships wouldn't join us. Similarly, a large number of sailors have been placed on the other ships. Only the minimum number needed to guarantee the successful voyage of the ship has been maintained." A very wise choice. Ludwell. That Admiral Hell Ludwell? Mr. Hanged Man mentioned him a long time ago. He said that he was beginning to study Sonia C's eastern end of the navigation. Klein nodded a little without a word. This was Gehrman Sparrow's bearing. He silently observed his surroundings and realized that the deck, the cabin, and spars were covered with mysterious and abstract symbols. As a whole, it looked like a gigantic ritualistic magic ceremony. It's like the Golden Dream. It's a sailboat of mystery, but it's not at the level of a ghost ship. Compared to Admiral of Stars and Vice Admiral Iceberg, Tracy, who has only become a pirate admiral for the past few months, clearly is considerably more inferior. The Black Death has nothing special about it. Klein retracted his gaze and followed Catalya to the cabin's entrance. Waiting here was a man in dungarees and a white shirt. He was in his 30s and looked strong and fit. He had thick body hair. As for his forearm, which was exposed outside, it seemed like he was donning a brown sweater. He wore a circular hair with a depression in the middle as he revealed a smile and stretched out his right hand. The first mate of the Future, Frank Lee. "Good evening, Mr. Sparrow. Poison expert Frank Lee, who has a bounty of 7,000 pounds. Klein instantly recognized the man. Considering how Gehrman Sparrow didn't have the habit of shaking hands, he bent his back slightly and said, "Good evening." Frank Lee retracted his right hand and glanced at Catalya. He said while maintaining his smile, "You seem to know me?" "That's right. The picture I took before is on my arrest warrant. Don't mind the poison expert title. I'm a very friendly person, as long as I'm not facing those darn bastards. My greatest hobby is to study soil and figure out cross-breeding techniques. Believe me, this is the future of humanity. But the people from the Church of Mother Earth don't believe him." Catalya gave Klein an introduction in the most subtle manner. "He's originally someone from the Church of Mother Earth? Cross-breeding techniques are good. As long as the quantity rises, it will be able to provide for more humans, raising the poverty line." Klein looked at Frank Lee, and he calmly said courteously and truthfully, "This is something commendable. Quote ellipsis. You are indeed an adventurer who doesn't share the viewpoint of the common man. Excellent. Excellent. There are just too few people like you. Frank Lee's blue eyes revealed a clear look of pleasant surprise. I've only tried crossbreeding a bull, a cow, and wheat together, allowing calves to be born like wheat. For that, I was almost sent to court by the Church of Mother Earth. My benevolent mother, they don't understand your true will at all. Crossbreeding a bull, a cow, and wheat. You devil. Only then did Klein realize that his understanding of crossbreeding techniques was different from what Frank Lee was talking about. He maintained a stoic expression without providing any further explanation. Under the lead of Frank Lee, who was reeling in a sudden bout of enthusiasm, Klein walked through the corridor beside Catalya. After stepping on the steps and arriving at a higher level, Klein's spiritual perception stirred as he cast his gaze to a shadow beside him. A figure grew out of the distorted darkness, a thin and tall but pale figure. His cheeks were nearly transparent, and his nose bridge was disharmonious and tall. His entire being gave off a sickly feeling. This is the second mate of the future, Heath Doyle, Frank Lee introduced with a smile. Bloodless Heath, whose bounty is higher than yours at £7,600? Klein quickly matched the face to the correct bounty notice. Heath nodded as a greeting before receding back into the shadows. He's a Rose Bishop. When turning around to head for the captain's cabin, Frank Lee warmly mentioned Heath Doyle's situation. You are telling me your second mate's sequence directly? Klein nearly pricked his brows. He secretly glanced at Catalya and discovered her masked exasperation. Are you puzzled and worried that he's a devout believer of the true creator, a lunatic who has been tainted? No, haha. He's a lucky fellow. Due to an incident, the ordinary him was scattered with the potion concocted from a Rose Bishop's Beander ingredients. The potion seeped into him, bit by bit, and he survived the ordeal. Finally, he became quite a special Beander. As he didn't experience the listener stage, he wasn't tainted, nor did he become a lunatic. As long as he doesn't proactively use the Beander power, listen, he remains an ordinary person, Frank Lee said in a flaunting tone. What an enviable fellow. He reached sequence 6 in one go. Furthermore, he didn't turn mentally unstable like the sea serpent, Calvatua. Klein sighed silently as he watched Admiral of Stars open the door to the captain's cabin. Catalya pointed inside. Your room is diagonally across from here. Frank will send you over. If there's anything, you can come to me directly. You can have your meals at the dining hall at any time. You can also get Frank to send someone to bring food to your room. What you choose is dependent on your preference. Admiral of Stars does things in a very clear and direct manner. Yes, she's a mature and wise lady. Klein praised inwardly as he replied without a change in expression, okay. He took this opportunity to glance at the layout of the captain's cabin, discovering that it contained a bookshelf, a full body mirror, a table, and a carpet. She actually reads. Isn't she unable to digest all the information the hidden sage imbues in her? Klein thought in amusement. At this moment, having seen their conversation come to an end, Frank Lee passionately promoted, Mr. Sparrow, would you like a serving of roasted potatoes tonight? When you chew it, it's like beef and its taste is like beef, but it's certainly potatoes. Will I get sick eating that? Klein answered coldly, I don't eat supper. All right then. Frank Lee drooped his shoulders and was just about to lead Klein to his room. Catalya suddenly thought of something and said, Mr. Sparrow, you've likely hunted quite a number of enemies and have received several spoils of war. I'm curious about the number of Beander characteristics you have left. Perhaps they can be used to reduce the remaining price of the trip. Klein considered for a moment and answered frankly, most of them have been sold. There's Interrogator, Pugilist, and Lunatic left. He didn't mention the all-black eye or the Beander characteristic of Nightmare. He really is the most famous adventurer during the past few months. Even after selling most of them, he still has 3 sets of Beander characteristics. Catalya sighed inwardly as she pondered. I want Pugilist. She had a warrior subordinate from the Gargaz archipelago who had long made enough contributions to apply for an advancement. There was no reason for Klein to decline Catalya's request. He thought for 2 seconds and said, £700. Very fair. Catalya didn't haggle. Sequence 8 Beander characteristics typically cost £600 to £700, but there was often a premium if someone was in desperate need for it. After all, such items seldom appeared at Beander gatherings. Klein didn't immediately complete the transaction. He raised his suitcase and said without a change in expression, I'll give it to you tomorrow. He didn't bring the Pugilist Beander characteristic with him, as most items of value had been thrown above the grey fog. Catalya wasn't surprised by Gehrman Sparrow's response. She nodded. That wouldn't be an issue. She had encountered many similar cases. It usually meant that the pugilist Beyander characteristic was stored with items which wasn't meant to be known by others. Therefore, it was impossible for Gehrman Sparrow to open his suitcase in front of her to complete the transaction on the spot. A crazy adventurer definitely had his secrets. Catalya paused for a second before adding, "There won't be any surveillance placed in your room. Whatever she could see had already been seen by her. It's fine." Klein curled the corners of his lips and coldly smiled. His previous considerations was to place down items like Azek's copper whistle and Will Ossepton's paper crane before holding a ritual or going above the grey fog. It was to resist any spying in the sense of mysticism. Then, he could use the washroom as a way to avoid physical surveillance. Of course, he wasn't too worried that Admiral of Stars would go overboard. He didn't believe that she was afraid of the crazy adventurer, Gehrman Sparrow, but that Catalya had no reason to do so. She definitely had milder and more concealed means of observing. For example, getting the help of a Beyander from the spectator pathway. Klein took off his hat, bowed, and followed poison expert Frank Lee to return to his own room. Seeing him walk off at an adequate speed, Catalya turned into the captain's cabin, picked up a heavy pair of glasses and wore it. Backland, at the Harvest Church south of the bridge. In the eyes of an ordinary person, Bishop Yutravsky, whose height was that of a half-giant, put down the Bible in his hand. He prayed once around the hall and smiled. The number of believers is increasing. Is that so? Emlyn White, who was in a brown priest robe, was wiping the candle racks as he said without even looking up. He knew that the number of believers of Mother Earth had indeed increased significantly. It would have been a miracle in the past to have a handful of people be in attendance for praying on weekdays or in the daytime. Now, there was often close to 10. Father Yutravsky looked down at the busy vampire priest and chuckled. Anyone can tell if they aren't blind. You have contributed greatly to this. If not for your concocting of the medicine and treating the plague, and your willingness and sincerity in teaching people about medicine, our faith wouldn't have been that easily accepted by the residents of this borough. Emlyn held a cloth and straightened his back. He tipped his chin slightly. I was only acting. What do you mean by, our faith? Don't lump me with you. Emlyn's expression twisted before he said with a smile, speaking of the blind, it reminds me of a joke. It's said that the demand for blind people in Backland far exceeds supply. This is because they are widely believed to be most suitable to be jurors. Father Yutravsky ignored the joke and benevolently said, regardless of the goal, you have contributed greatly to the spread of the faith of Mother Earth. Besides, this also proves that you have a kind heart. Phooey. I said so back then, but why didn't you believe me? Emlyn looked up at the priest's massive body before retracting his gaze in silence. After busying himself at the cathedral, he changed into his normal clothes and wore a silk top hat that sheltered him from the sun. He then walked onto Rose Street. He stealthily sized up his surroundings and didn't notice any signs of monitoring. The red glove named Leonard from before really hasn't appeared again. I thought my act of exposing his secrets and buying tinder would result in me being constantly investigated in secret. Emlyn White shook his head indiscernibly as he felt puzzled. In the earliest stages, he had planned on taking in the Hanged Man's theory to incur the investigations of the Red Gloves so as to disrupt the monitoring from the upper echelons of the Sanguine. He could then achieve a perfect equilibrium by using the Church of Mother Earth's Blessed, Yutravsky. But things didn't develop as he had expected. Leonard Mitchell had apparently left Backland very quickly. At the end of February, Emlyn had made a detour to 7 Pinster Street while he was out once, only to discover that it was uninhabited. Without thinking about this matter any further, he walked to the end of the street, got onto a rental carriage and headed straight for the Odora Villa. He was left to a study on the first floor by an attendant where he saw many Sanguine who had recently come of age. Among them was a Sanguine who had already become a baron. I'm not the only one? He thought before closing the door. He then said to the owner, Cosme Odora, my lord, was I not called here because of a summoning from Lord Nibs? He had said, my lord, rather indifferently as though he was calling him by name. This was because he was also a Sanguine baron. The difference was that he hadn't publicized it. Cosme was a very refined middle-aged gentleman. He smiled and said, all of you are outstanding young Sanguine. My grandfather has entrusted all of you with some tests. Another Sanguine baron, Russ Bottori, who was lucky to receive an inheritance, asked, what tests are they? Cosme drank a mouthful of dark red blood which was concocted with grape wine as he scanned the area. Perhaps you might not know, but the Snake of Fate from the Life School of Thought has disappeared for quite some time. As Emlyn White and the other Sanguine looked puzzled, Cosme continued, but I believe all of you should know that the Life School of Thought is a coalition which was barely formed thanks to their belief in fate. They allied under the massive pressure placed by the 7 Orthodox churches in the beginning of the Fifth Epoch and are formed by beyonders who think of themselves as absolutely rational and aloof, those that worship the primordial moon, and those that seek the essence of life and spirituality. Due to the existence of the Snake of Fate, there hadn't been many serious problems internally. Their worship of the primordial moon was ultimately restricted to a fixed symbolic meaning. Furthermore, the process of formula exchange was melded with a master-apprentice heritage system. Unfortunately, with the disappearance of the Snake of Fate, this process has been disrupted. The primordial moon's believers rapidly turn passionate, producing a fracture in the faction that represents fate. An intense conflict ensued as a result. This matter was used by the Rose School of Thought. It dealt quite a sizable amount of damage to them. Emlyn White, Russ Batory, and other Sanguine remained perplexed. After sharing the background information, Cosme dived into the details. Worshippers of the primordial moon are our eternal enemies. They have always been hunting us, concocting us into potions to achieve strength. Now, we will not let go of such an opportunity. Here's a list of primordial moon worshippers and their situations. Whoever finds them and kills them will be the victor of this test. My grandfather, as well as various important figures, would reward you generously. If you complete a portion of the list, we will determine this by numbers. Of course, these people were selected, and all of you are capable of dealing with them. The rest will be tracked down by the important figures. Upon hearing the first few sentences, Emlyn White had no intention of participating, despite having hatred for those artificial vampires. He found the matter troublesome, laborious, and tiresome. He'd rather stay at home in silence to chat with his dolls. By the time he realized that it was a competition, as well as sensing the gazes of Russ Batory and the other Sanguine which were cast on him, Emlyn suddenly straightened his back and tipped his chin. No problem. His red eyes slowly swept across the other creatures in the room. On the future, inside a spacious room with an attached bathroom. Klein stood in front of the window, looking out into the undulating blue ocean. In a good mood, he breathed in the cold winds that came from the north. The flagship of the Admiral of Stars had already separated from the other ships in the fleet as it began to cruise alone. After an unknown period of time, 2 whaling ships appeared ahead. Once they noticed the flag containing the Stars and I flying from the future, they immediately responded nervously. They quickly adjusted their positions, aiming their starboards over, their cannons ready to shoot at any moment. At the same time, spears and harpoons, which were shot using explosives, were directed in the same direction. The blonde and large fishermen from the Gargaz archipelago held tridents and guns as they braced for an attack, either by standing or crouching. Klein also noticed that there were a number of women with figures similar to the Hulk. It was obvious at a glance that they were heavy and good at fighting. The future didn't mind their welcome. It continued cruising past them, heading deeper into the whaling route. After cruising for a while, Klein saw more pirate ships ahead. They were clustered around the sea route's periphery, their motives unknown. The future came close without standing on ceremony. Immediately, the pirate ships reacted like startled birds as they quickly retreated. Sensing the future slowing down, Klein left his room in puzzlement. Just as he approached the captain's cabin, he discovered Catalya walking out. This woman wore a thick pair of glasses on her nosebridge, hiding her mysterious purple eyes. She glanced at Klein and said succinctly, "Someone discovered a ruin which is said to be from the 4th epoch at the bottom of the sea in the waters around here. We plan on taking a look while on the way." Bottom of the sea? Ruin from the 4th epoch? Klein instantly recalled the rumor he had heard from the Lerdelbar. So this piece of news has already spread? I was wondering why I got to learn it so easily, he said inwardly in enlightenment. Klein had a certain degree of curiosity towards the outcome of the exploration. He didn't ask further as he walked past the captain's cabin and walked down the stairwell. After a few seconds, he felt his throat itch. He couldn't help but raise his fist to his mouth and cough. Klein wasn't surprised by such a development, as it was inevitable. He had carried the biological poison bottle for more than 2 hours last night. Only when it was late at night and his confirmation that Admiral of Stars and crew didn't have any intention of attacking him did he move the mystical item into a black suitcase. Sadly, he ended up falling sick. Of course, the amount of time he brought the biological poison bottle with him wasn't considered long. His body wasn't in a weakened state, so his resulting illness wasn't anything serious. He just felt his tonsils swell in pain. Catalya, who was walking slowly behind, saw this scene, but she didn't find it a problem. Instead, she found it normal. It was common knowledge for knowledgeable Beyonders that mystical items were bound to have negative side effects. Furthermore, they would learn from the 7 Orthodox churches and categorize those with serious side effects which made them impossible to possess or use for prolonged time as sealed artifacts. The reason why Catalya had sold or exchanged many of her low and mid-level mystical items was firstly because she wanted to better strengthen her survivability. Secondly, the various negative effects from multiple items were troubling. Often, one could avoid one but not the other. Some negative effects might even stack and synergize into something worse. Therefore, to most Beyonders, the disadvantages surpassed the advantages. She discovered that Gehrman Sparrow had used mystical items, Beyonder weapons, and spirituality charms to arm himself to the teeth. While being amazed, she was already guessing at the type of negative effects he was facing. From what she saw today, it was a temporary simple illness. With steady steps, Klein arrived on the deck and saw Frank Lee. He was still dressed in a white shirt and dungarees. His arm was stained with dirt as though he wasn't afraid of the cold winds that blew down at him. "Good morning, Gehrman." Frank warmly waved his hand and said, "Here, try my latest product. This is definitely the most welcomed item at sea." As he said, he raised his other hand. And it was a wide and fat fish of an unknown breed. "No, I don't want to know what monster you have cooked up this time." Klein paused in his footsteps as he looked at him with a cold expression. Frank Lee didn't discover any problems with his attitude. He pulled out a dagger from his waist and stabbed the fish before slicing a hole open. Blood flowed out and accurately landed in a large beer cup on the deck. It didn't emit any fishy smell. "Smell that? It's such an intoxicating alcoholic fragrance." Frank Lee half closed his eyes as he fervently said, "This is a fish who has red wine replacing its blood. As such, the wine contains lots of nutrients." Klein realized he was at a loss for words. Frank looked at the surrounding sailors in excitement before saying to Gehrman Sparrow, "Do you know what's the most troubling matter out at sea? That's when we run out of alcohol without being anywhere close to shore. As long as this kind of fish can rapidly reproduce and become the sea's primary produce, then we won't be lacking any alcohol no matter where we are. By the way, they can be categorized by species. Some will produce Lanti-proof, others Nepos, red wine, and beer. The beer needs to come from sharks or whales. Otherwise, there won't be enough. Isn't the most troubling matter the lack of water? Of course, all of you can use beer to replace water most of the time because it doesn't easily spoil. Those poor fishes." Klein was pondering over a response to Frank when Catalya came on deck. She walked past him and questioned her first mate. "Is Nina done with her preparations?" "Yes, she has already finished a bottle of Nepos." Frank pointed at a shadow formed by the sails. "The so-called preparations are to drink a bottle of Nepos, a specialty of Fasak? The Nepos which can light a fire." Klein suddenly felt that Nina, the lady mentioned by the first mate, was likely someone with Fasak blood. "Captain, I want a bottle of Sonia bloodwine more." In the dark, a female figure slowly stood up and walked over. She was more than 1.8 meters tall. Her blonde hair was casually tied up into a high pigtail. Her facial features weren't anything outstanding, but she had the striking traits of someone from Fasak. Her skin was fair and her eyes were dull. This lady named Nina wore a black tight suit made of fish skin. The top and bottom seemed to be a one-piece, fully accentuating her stunning figure. Such a style was rather sexy to begin with. Nina's breasts were also far above what was normal. It was obvious what the surrounding pirates were looking at. Klein felt a little embarrassed and wished to move his gaze away. However, on second thought, Gehrman Sparrow was definitely not such an untried person. All he could do was empty his gaze and look straight at Nina's face. "Gehrman, this is our bosun, Nina. She's also the navigator's assistant." "Haha, her sequence's name is Seafarer." Frank Lee still didn't hold back in his introductions. Apart from his research of crossbreeding, this poison expert is rather simple. "I now recall that this lady named Nina has a bounty of 3,600 pounds. Her nickname is Seabed Murderer. Sigh, after seeing so many bounty notices, there are some I can't immediately recall." Klein looked at Nina's eyes and nodded calmly. "Good morning, ma'am." Nina held back her smile and sized up Klein. "Good morning, Mr. Sparrow. I'm very curious if Vice Admiral Ailment is really as charming as the rumors say?" As a female pirate who had mixed with low and mid-class people for extended periods of time, she was always very frank and direct towards both men and women. She didn't show any coyness. She had originally planned on asking Gehrman Sparrow if she was lacking in charm, or ask if he was the cold type, which resulted in her being completely ignored or him showing any reaction. But considering how the man standing before her was a powerful guy, an adventurer who nearly successfully hunted Vice Admiral Ailment, or a lunatic who could draw his gun and shoot at any moment, she rationally held back her jesting words. She switched to asking about Vice Admiral Ailment. "How am I to answer you?" Klein gloomily said. "Her bounty is extremely charming." Nina was taken aback, somewhat at a loss for a response to continue the conversation. Hence, she turned to look at Admiral of Stars. "Captain, do we begin now?" Catalya, who felt her bounty flash through her mind for some baffling reason, nodded. "Begin." Just as she said that, Nina took large strides to the side of the ship. With her right hand supporting herself, she leapt into the sea, swimming downwards like a gigantic black fish. At the same time, there were a few splashes. A few sailors had jumped down as well to provide her aid. She begins at the mention of it. She didn't need any additional time to prepare. This lady has the temperament of the Church of Storms. As expected of a Beyonder from the sailor pathway, Klein looked out the ship as he couldn't help but cough. "You're sick?" Frank Lee asked directly. Klein nodded slightly and said, "A little." Frank thought for a moment. He didn't say a word as he rushed back into the cabin, his destination unknown. By the side, Catalya nudged her heavy glasses and smiled. Frank is a poison expert, but he's also an outstanding doctor. As expected of someone from the planter pathway, Klein didn't ask further as he stood there, awaiting Nina's preliminary exploration. Seeing the sudden silence that became somewhat awkward, Catalya took a few steps forward and said, seemingly in passing, "In another day, we will be leaving the Whaling Sea route." "But we're at least a week from those waters?" Klein thought before asking. "That is if we follow the Whaling Sea route. In fact, this will lead further north and be more roundabout. I know of a secret sea route that can allow us to reach the waters you wish to go to in 2 to 3 days. Catalya's gaze looked at Klein's eyes through her thick glasses, as though she wanted to tell how much he knew of the extremely dangerous waters. Klein considered and simply said, "Very good. That's exactly what I want. In addition, those waters are more illusory than real." Catalya retracted her gaze in thought as she looked at the entrance to the cabin. Frank Lee ran over and held a green apple in his hand. "This is the outcome of another one of my projects. It's a cross-breed of medicine and fruits. It makes the consumption of medicine more enjoyable." He beamed as he handed Klein the apple. "I'm afraid I'll end up even sicker after eating it." Klein glanced at Admiral of Stars and saw her nod gently. Only then did he inwardly force himself to accept the apple while appearing calm on the outside. He then bit down at the apple. It had the taste of a normal apple. It just had a lot more juice, and the insides were softer. After a few bites, Klein discovered that his throat suddenly wasn't hurting. He didn't realize when he stopped coughing. "I have to say that it's rather magical. As long as it doesn't involve animals and humans, Frank Lee is really a genius that should be taken seriously in the Church of Mother Earth." Unfortunately, he ultimately became a devil-like person. Klein looked at the poison expert and said frankly, "It's healed." "Very good." Frank didn't praise himself as he began casually introducing the pirates on the deck. After a while, Nina and the other supporting sailors swam up to the surface and returned to the ship. She held a metallic piece that had been rotten into an identifiable state and a piece of black-hardened mud that was filled with honeycombed holes. She grumbled to Catalya, "Captain, there's no deep-sea well. That well's mouth isn't even bigger than my breasts. Of course, it's very deep and dark. It's unknown what's hidden in it." She gestured using her hands. Exaggeration is a common trait of pirates and adventurers. Catalya nodded without using the term, bragging. "The diameter of the well's mouth is that small?" Klein puzzledly looked at the item in Nina's hand as he politely diverted his gaze from her body, which had streams of water flowing down. Catalya's gaze moved in sync with his as she said, "Go into the details."